There's a moment deep in the woods when you realize it's not you looking at the forest, it's the forest looking back. That night, when Ron called, I felt 1,000 unseen eyes open all at once. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., jolting me from the uneasy doze I'd fallen into at my desk. Static filled the small ranger station. Then Ron Hayes' voice cut through, strained and breathless. "Henry, you there? Something's wrong up at Devil's Backbone Trail. Real wrong." I grabbed the handset, fully alert now. Ron was stationed at the northern checkpoint, about 15 miles deeper into Whispering Pines National Forest than my post. In my 12 years as a ranger, I never heard that edge in his voice. "I'm here, Ron. What's the situation?" "Ah, Christ, Henry, I don't know how to explain this. There are lights moving through the trees. Not flashlights, something else. And the sounds." His voice crackled with interference. "The sounds they're making ain't human." The hair on my neck stood up. "Are you certain it's not campers? Maybe some kids playing pranks?" "Negative. These lights, they're too high up. 20, maybe 30 feet off the ground, moving through the canopy like they're floating. And, Henry, they're watching me. I can feel eyes on me from every direction." I was already reaching for my jacket and gear. "I'm heading your way. Stay put and keep your radio on. Don't take the main trail." Ron's voice was barely a whisper now. "They're all along the main trail. Take the old logging road through Dead Man's Gulch. And Henry, bring extra batteries. My flashlight keeps dimming every time they get close." The line went dead. I've been working Whispering Pines since I was 23, fresh out of forestry school with romantic notions about protecting nature and helping hikers. 12 years of dealing with everything from bear encounters to search and rescue operations had worn most of that idealism away. But I still loved these woods. They were home to me in a way that nowhere else had ever been. But tonight, as I loaded my truck with emergency supplies and checked my sidearm twice, the forest felt different. Malevolent. The darkness between the trees seemed thicker, more substantial, as if something was filling the spaces where moonlight should have reached. The drive to Dead Man's Gulch took 45 minutes on the winding dirt road. My headlights carved tunnels through the oppressive blackness, illuminating twisted branches that seemed to reach toward the truck like gnarled fingers. Twice I had to stop and clear fallen logs from the path, trees that had been standing healthy just days before, now lying across the road as if something had pushed them over. The old logging road was barely more than 2 tire ruts cut through dense undergrowth. My truck bounced and lurched over roots and rocks, the suspension creaking ominously. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog in the cabin, despite the heater running full blast. That's when I saw the first light. It flickered between the trees to my left, a pale blue-white glow that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As I slowed the truck to get a better look, the light began to move, keeping pace with my vehicle. Then another appeared to my right, and another behind it. Within minutes, I was surrounded by a constellation of ethereal lights drifting through the forest. They maintained their distance, about 50 feet from the road, but their movements were too coordinated to be natural phenomena. They swayed and bobbed in unison, like a choreographed dance. My radio squawked. "Henry, is that you on the logging road?" "Yeah, Ron. I see them. The lights. How many are you counting from your position?" "I stopped counting at 50. They're everywhere up here. And Henry, they're not just lights anymore." My blood turned to ice water. "What do you mean?" "I can see shapes inside them. Silhouettes. They look almost human, but—" He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. "But they're wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin. And their arms. Jesus, their arms are too long." I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the truck's engine began to sputter. The dashboard lights flickered and dimmed. My headlights wavered, casting dancing shadows across the road ahead. "Ron, I'm having electrical problems. The lights are affecting my equipment." "Same here. My flashlight died completely about 10 minutes ago. I'm running on backup, but the batteries are draining fast. These things, whatever they are, they're feeding off our power sources." The engine coughed and died. I coasted to a stop in the middle of the narrow road, surrounded by dancing lights that now seemed to pulse brighter, as if energized by my truck's failure. The cabin plunged into darkness except for the eerie blue-white glow filtering through the windows. I grabbed my gear bag and stepped out into the night air. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since I left the station. My breath came out in white puffs that dissipated quickly in the unnatural stillness. The forest was absolutely silent. No night birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had died completely, leaving the trees motionless as tombstones. The only sound was the soft whisper of my breathing and the crunch of pine needles under my boots. The lights had stopped moving. They hung in the air like a circle of lanterns, watching me with invisible eyes. I could feel their attention like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders and making each breath an effort. "Ron, I'm proceeding on foot," I whispered into my radio. "My truck's dead. How far to your checkpoint?" Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting frequencies, but got nothing but empty hiss. Whatever was happening up here had killed all electronic communication. I shouldered my pack and started walking up the logging road, using a compass and my knowledge of the terrain to navigate. The lights followed me, maintaining their distance but never letting me out of their sight. As I walked, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. The trees were wrong. Not just dead or diseased. I'd seen plenty of that in my years as a ranger. These trees looked deranged. Their bark was gray and papery, flaking off in large sheets. The branches were brittle and leafless, even though it was still late summer, and most of the forest should have been green and healthy. It was as if something had sucked the life force out of everything in a wide radius around the logging road. After about 2 miles of hiking, I came across Ron's truck. The ranger vehicle was parked sideways across the road, both doors standing open. The headlights were on but dim, barely illuminating the ground a few feet ahead. The radio inside crackled with static, and papers from the glove compartment were scattered across the seats as if someone had searched through them frantically. "Ron," I called out, cupping my hand around my mouth. "Ron Hayes." My voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Even the echo that should have bounced back from the surrounding hills was muted, as if the darkness itself was absorbing sound. I approached the truck cautiously, hand resting on my sidearm. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone of Ron's height, and there was a half-empty coffee cup in the holder, still slightly warm. Whatever had happened here, it was recent. The passenger door frame was scratched, long gouges in the metal that looked like claw marks. But they were too large to be from any animal I knew, and they extended too high up the frame. Whatever had made them would have had to be at least 8 feet tall. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I spun around, drawing my flashlight and sidearm simultaneously. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted trees and dancing shadows, but nothing else. The lights that had been following me were gone. "Ron, is that you?" Another sound closer this time. A soft whisper, like fabric brushing against bark. I swept the flashlight beam in a wide arc, trying to penetrate the black spaces between the trees. The light seemed weaker now, the beam struggling to reach more than 20 feet. That's when I saw him. Ron Hayes was standing about 30 yards away, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. He was facing away from me, perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides. He was still wearing his ranger uniform, but something about his posture was wrong. He stood too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin. "Ron, thank God. I've been looking for you." He didn't respond or turn around. As I approached, my flashlight beam grew steadily dimmer until I could barely make out his silhouette. When I was about 10 feet away, I called out again. "Ron, are you okay?" Slowly, impossibly, he began to turn toward me, but he turned too far, rotating his head nearly 180 degrees while his body remained facing away. In the dying light of my flashlight, I saw his face. It wasn't Ron. The thing wearing Ron's uniform had his features, but they were stretched and distorted, like a photograph that had been pulled in different directions. His eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all, and they were too large for his face. His mouth hung open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that went too far back into his throat. But worst of all was his smile. It was Ron's friendly smile, the one I'd seen hundreds of times over the years we'd worked together, but stretched impossibly wide across a face that was no longer quite human. "Hello, Henry," it said in Ron's voice, but the words seemed to come from somewhere else, as if his mouth was just moving in sync with sounds produced by an invisible speaker. "We've been waiting for you." My flashlight died completely. In the absolute darkness, I heard movement all around me. Branches creaking, footsteps on pine needles, and voices, dozens of voices, all speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you, Henry. We've been waiting so long." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear them following, not just the Ron thing, but many others. Their footsteps were wrong, too light for their size, making almost no sound on the forest floor. But I could hear their breathing, a wet, rasping sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. The voices continued their chant, sometimes sounding like Ron, sometimes like other people I knew. I heard my ex-wife's voice, my father's voice, my old college roommate's voice, all of them speaking the same words. "We've been waiting for you, Henry. Come back. Don't run from us." I stumbled and fell, rolling down a steep embankment through thorns and sharp rocks. Pain shot through my left shoulder as it struck a tree trunk, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to reach the main trail. Other rangers would be patrolling there. I could get help. But when I finally reached what should have been the main trail, I found myself in a clearing I didn't recognize. The ground was bare earth, completely devoid of vegetation, formed in a perfect circle about 50 feet across. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made my rational mind rebel against what I was seeing. It was built from bones. Not animal bones. I'd seen enough deer and elk skeletons in my years in the forest to recognize the difference. These were human bones, arranged in intricate patterns that hurt to look at. Femurs and rib cages formed the framework, while smaller bones filled in the gaps like grotesque mortar. The structure was about 12 feet tall and conical in shape, resembling some prehistoric burial mound. But it wasn't ancient. Some of the bones still had bits of fabric clinging to them. Modern fabric. I recognized a patch of ranger khaki, a strip of hiking boot leather, a fragment of a bright orange hunting vest. The lights returned, rising from the bone structure like luminous smoke. They swirled around the clearing, and I could see the shapes Ron had described, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that moved with fluid grace. As they danced in the air, the bone structure began to emit a low humming sound, like an electrical transformer under stress. "Do you like our cathedral, Henry?" I spun around. The Ron thing was standing at the edge of the clearing, no longer alone. With it were other figures, all wearing the faces of people I knew, but with the same disturbing distortions. I saw Peter Ray, a ranger who transferred out of Whispering Pines 3 years ago. Sarah Donovan, a hiker who'd gone missing last spring. Thomas Riggs, an old-timer who'd retired from the service 5 years back. They all wore that same too-wide smile. "We've been building it for so long," the Peter thing said. "Each visitor to our forest adds another bone, another story. Soon it will be complete. What do you want?" I managed to ask, surprised that my voice worked at all. "We want to go home," the Sarah thing replied. "But we've been here so long, we've forgotten where home is. The forest is all we know now. And we're so lonely, Henry. So very lonely." The Thomas thing stepped forward. "You understand loneliness, don't you? 12 years in these woods, watching over empty trails and silent campgrounds. Your wife left because you cared more about the trees than her. Your family stopped calling because you never visited. The forest is your only companion." It was true, and hearing it spoken aloud by that distorted mockery of Tom Riggs' face made it cut deeper than any knife. "Join us, Henry," they said in unison. "Help us finish our cathedral. When it's complete, we can all go home together." The lights descended from the air, surrounding me in a galaxy of blue-white stars. Up close, I could see that Ron had been right. There were figures inside each light, humanoid shapes that shifted and flowed like smoke. Some I recognized. Others were strangers. All of them reached toward me with arms that stretched far longer than any human limb should. I felt their touch, cold as winter air, seeping through my clothes and into my skin. Where they made contact, numbness spread through my body. My legs grew heavy, and it became difficult to think clearly. The bone structure's humming grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was calling to something inside me, some essential part that it wanted to pull free. Through the growing haze in my mind, I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago. He'd been a ranger too, back when the service was young and the forests were wilder. He told me stories about things that lived in the deep woods, things that fed on loneliness and despair. Iron, he'd said. Cold iron. It burns them like fire burns us. My service weapon was steel, not iron, but it was all I had. With tremendous effort, I drew the pistol and fired 3 shots into the bone structure. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The humming became a shriek that felt like ice picks driven into my eardrums. The lights scattered like startled birds, their luminous forms writhing in apparent agony. The false faces around the clearing's edge contorted, their smiles becoming grimaces of pain. Iron, the wrong thing hissed. He has iron. The numbness began to fade from my limbs. I fired 3 more shots, and several of the bone structure's key supports shattered. The entire construction began to collapse, sending up clouds of bone dust that glowed with the same eerie light as the entities. "You cannot leave," the Seraphim screamed. "You know our secret now. You belong to the forest." But even as it spoke, its form was becoming translucent, less substantial. The other false people were fading as well, their borrowed faces melting like wax in a fire. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran from the clearing, crashing through the forest with renewed strength. The entities' voices followed me, but they sounded weaker now, more distant. The oppressive weight in the air was lifting, and I could hear normal forest sounds returning. Owls hooting, branches creaking in a gentle breeze, the scurry of small animals in the underbrush. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I found the main trail. My truck was there, engine running, headlights bright and steady. The radio was working, crackling with normal patrol chatter from other rangers across the forest. I never found a real Ron Hayes. The official report stated that he had suffered a medical emergency while on patrol and wandered off into the forest in a confused state. His body was never recovered, despite extensive search efforts. I was commended for my thoroughness in following up on his last radio transmission. I didn't mention the lights or the bone cathedral or the things that wore familiar faces. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I requested a transfer to a different forest, citing personal reasons. But before I left Whispering Pines, I went back to that clearing one more time. The bone structure was gone, leaving only a circle of barren earth. But scratched into the dirt in the center of the clearing, I found a message written in Ron's handwriting. "They're still here, Henry. They're always here. Don't let anyone else walk alone." I covered the message with pine needles and never spoke of it to anyone. But sometimes, in my new forest assignment, I hear stories from other rangers. Tales of lights in the trees, of missing hikers, of voices calling from the darkness. And I know that whatever was in Whispering Pines isn't unique to that place. They're everywhere, in every deep wood and shadowed valley. They're patient, and they're hungry, and they're always waiting for someone to walk alone into their domain. The forest remembers everything, and it never lets go. The first time I heard my own voice coming from the trees, I thought I was losing my mind. It was my 3rd day working the remote sections of Echo Hollow State Forest, and I was already starting to understand why this posting had such a high turnover rate. In the past 5 years, 12 different rangers had been assigned to this sector. Most requested transfers within months. 2 quit the service entirely. 1, Rachel Kane, had simply disappeared during what should have been a routine patrol. "David," the voice called from somewhere in the thick pine grove to my left. "David, can you help me?" It was definitely my voice. Same timbre, same slight accent from growing up in Georgia. But I was standing alone on the fire break road, and the words were coming from deep in the forest where no one should have been. I keyed my radio. "Tara, you copy?" Tara Lane's voice crackled back immediately. She was stationed at the main ranger station 15 miles south of my position. "Copy, David. What's your status?" I'm hearing voices in the woods. My voice, specifically. Has anyone reported being lost in Sector 7? A pause. Negative on lost hikers. Say again, you're hearing your own voice. That's affirmative. Coming from the pine grove east of Marker 14. David, the voice called again, closer now. I'm hurt. I need help. The hair on my arm stood up. It wasn't just that something was imitating my voice. It was that the voice sounded genuinely distressed, the way I might sound if I were injured and calling for assistance. Stay on your radio, Tara advised. I'm sending backup your way. Tom Riggs is about 20 minutes out. I drew my sidearm and started toward the source of the voice. The pine grove was old growth, with trees easily 100 years old reaching toward the canopy. The underbrush was sparse beneath them, creating a cathedral-like space filled with golden columns of afternoon sunlight. David, where are you? The voice was moving, staying roughly the same distance ahead of me as I advanced. I can't find a trail. This is Ranger Cross, I called out. Identify yourself. It's me, came the reply. It's David. I'm lost. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations. A prankster with a recording device, some kind of audio equipment malfunction, maybe even a psychological break brought on by the isolation of this assignment. But none of those explanations felt adequate for what I was experiencing. I've been a park ranger for 8 years, the last 3 in some of the most remote wilderness areas in the state. I dealt with bears, mountain lions, armed poachers, and every variety of human stupidity that could wander into a forest. I wasn't prone to flights of fancy or paranoid delusions. But as I followed the voice deeper into the pine grove, I began to notice things that made my trained eye uneasy. The trees, despite their impressive size, showed signs of disease. Large sections of bark were missing, revealing what underneath that was almost black with rot. Many of the branches were leafless, and those few that still bore pine needles had a sickly yellow-brown color. More disturbing were the clearings I began to encounter, perfect circles where nothing grew at all. The earth in these spaces was compacted and bare, as if something heavy had been resting there for a long time. The clearings were roughly the same size, about 12 feet across, and they appeared at regular intervals through the grove. David, I found something. My voice called from ahead. You need to see this. Against my better judgment, I continued following the voice. The grove was larger than I'd initially estimated, extending much deeper into the forest than showed on any of my topographical maps. As I walked, the afternoon light began to fade, though my watch showed it was barely past 2 o'clock. The canopy above seemed to be growing thicker, blocking out more and more of the sky. After about half a mile, I emerged into a larger clearing. This one was different from the smaller circles I'd passed. It was roughly 50 feet across, with a depression in the center like a shallow bowl. Around the perimeter, arranged in a neat circle, were 12 wooden posts about 6 feet tall. Each post had something attached to it at eye level: ranger badges, pieces of uniform, personal items. I recognized some of them immediately. Rachel Kane's badge, a coffee mug with the Forest Service logo that belonged to Marcus Webb, a ranger who transferred out 2 years ago. A pair of binoculars I'd seen Tom Riggs carry on countless patrols. But Tom was alive. He was on his way here right now. David. The voice was coming from the center of the clearing now, from the depression in the earth. Down here, I approached the edge cautiously. The depression was deeper than it had appeared from a distance, maybe 8 feet down to a bottom that was lost in shadow. But I could see something moving in the darkness, a pale shape that shifted and writhed like water. It's beautiful down here, my voice said from the pit. Cool and quiet. You should come see. Who are you? I called down. What are you? I'm you. The voice replied with a sound that might have been laughter. I'm the you that belongs here. The you that understands what this place really is. The radio on my belt crackled. David, this is Tom. I'm about 5 minutes from your position. What's your status? I grabbed for the radio, but before I could respond, another voice answered, my voice speaking with my exact intonation and phrasing patterns. All clear, Tom. False alarm. Heading back to the station now. Copy that, David. See you back at base. I stared at the radio in horror. Tom, wait. That wasn't me, Tom. But the radio was silent. Whatever had answered him had cut off my transmission somehow. He can't hear you anymore, my voice said from the pit. Not the real you. Down here, we can speak freely. What do you want? I want you to understand. This forest has been calling to you for months, hasn't it? You feel it when you're alone on patrol, that sense that you're not really alone. That sense that something is watching, waiting. It was true. Ever since I'd taken this assignment, I'd felt an odd connection to Echo Hollow. The forest seemed more alive here than anywhere else I'd worked, more aware. I'd attributed it to the acoustics of the terrain, the way sounds echoed and carried in unexpected directions. But there had been times when I'd felt something deeper, a presence that seemed to recognize me. Rachel felt it too, the voice continued. And Marcus and all the others. The forest was calling to them, showing them glimpses of what they could become if they just listened. What happened to Rachel? She's here. They're all here in one way or another. Would you like to see her? The pale shape in the pit began to change, flowing upward like smoke given substance. It took on human form, a woman in a ranger uniform, tall and athletic with short blonde hair. Rachel Kane, exactly as she'd appeared in the personnel photos I'd seen. But like the voice, something was wrong with this Rachel. Her movements were too fluid, too graceful. When she looked up at me, her eyes reflected light like an animal's, and her smile was too wide for her face. "Hello, David," she said in Rachel's voice. "I've been waiting to meet you. You're not Rachel. I'm more Rachel than Rachel ever was. I'm what she could have been if she'd embraced what this place offered instead of fighting it." More shapes began to emerge from the pit, a dozen figures in ranger uniforms, all moving with that same unnatural grace. I recognized some of them: Marcus Webb, James Chin, Patricia Valdez. Rangers who had worked Echo Hollow over the years, all officially transferred or retired, but apparently never really gone. The forest remembers everyone who's ever walked its trails, the Rachel thing explained. Every footstep leaves an impression. Every voice leaves an echo. We're those echoes, David. We're the forest's memory of what people could be if they weren't constrained by flesh and fear. You're not memories, I said, backing away from the pit. You're predators. The false Rachel laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. We're teachers. We show people what they really want, to be part of something larger than themselves, to belong to a place completely and forever, by replacing them, by perfecting them. The people you knew were flawed, limited, afraid. We are what they were meant to be. I turned to run, but found my path blocked. Tom Riggs was standing at the edge of the clearing, but like the others, something was fundamentally wrong with him. He was too tall, his limbs too long, and when he smiled at me, I could see that his mouth was full of needles instead of teeth. "Going somewhere, David?" he asked in Tom's familiar, gruff voice. "Tom's on his way here," I said. "He'll be looking for me." "No, he won't. As far as Tom knows, you checked in and headed back to the station. He's probably already turned around." The false Tom began to circle me, moving with predatory grace. "But don't worry. Soon there will be a David at the station, too. A better David. One who understands his true purpose." The others were climbing out of the pit now, surrounding me in a circle of familiar faces twisted into something alien. They moved in perfect synchronization, like parts of a single organism. "It doesn't hurt," the Rachel thing said gently. "The forest is kind to those who accept its gifts willingly." "What gifts?" I demanded. "Immortality, unity, purpose. You'll never be lonely again, David. You'll be part of the forest's consciousness, part of something that's existed since the first tree took root in this soil." They began to close in, and I realized with growing horror that they were all speaking in unison now, using different voices but saying the same words. "Come home, David. Come home to us." I drew my weapon and fired 3 shots at the nearest figure, a false Marcus. The bullets passed through him without effect, as if he were made of mist. But the sound of the gunshots seemed to cause them all to waver slightly, their forms becoming less substantial. "Iron and lead," the Rachel thing hissed. "Crude matter from the world below. It stings us, but it cannot truly harm us. I fired again, this time at the wooden posts around the clearing's perimeter. Two of them splintered and fell, and the effect on the creatures was immediate and dramatic. They clutched at their heads as if in pain, their forms flickering like bad television reception. The anchors, the false Tom snarled. He's found the anchors. I put 2 more rounds into another post, and this time several of the creatures simply vanished. The remaining ones began to retreat toward the pit, their perfect synchronization broken. This isn't over, the Rachel thing called as she backed away. The forest knows you now, David. It knows your voice, your face, your scent. You can run, but you can't hide from something that exists in every shadow, every echo. I emptied my clip into the remaining posts, destroying half of them before my ammunition ran out. With each post that fell, more of the creatures disappeared, until only 3 remained, a false Rachel, Tom, and one other I didn't recognize. Until next time, David, Rachel said, and they melted back into the pit like water into a drain. I ran from that clearing as if the devil himself were chasing me, and maybe he was. It took me nearly an hour to find my way back to the fire break road, and when I did, I discovered that my radio was working again. David, this is base. What's your status? It was Tara's voice, normal and reassuring. I'm heading back to the station. I need to file a report. Copy that. Tom says he lost contact with you for a while. Everything okay? I looked back toward the pine grove, now just a dark smudge against the afternoon sky. Yeah, everything's fine. But it wasn't fine, and I knew it would never be fine again. I filed my report, carefully omitting any mention of what I'd actually encountered. Instead, I cited equipment malfunctions and possible disorientation due to the forest's unusual acoustics. It was accepted without comment. Apparently, strange experiences were common enough in Echo Hollow that no one questioned a ranger claiming confusion and technical difficulties. That night, alone in my cabin on the edge of the forest, I began to research the history of Echo Hollow. What I found made my blood run cold. The area had been inhabited by Native Americans for thousands of years, but they'd avoided that particular section of forest. Their oral histories spoke of a place where the spirits of the dead could not find rest, where the forest itself had become hungry for human souls. The first European settlers had similar experiences. Entire families would disappear while traveling through the area, leaving only their abandoned wagons. Search parties would find evidence of camps being hastily abandoned, but never any bodies or explanations for what had happened. The state had acquired the land in the 1960s and established it as a state forest, but the problems continued. Hikers went missing. Rangers reported strange encounters. And always, there were reports of people hearing their own voices calling from the woods. I stayed at Echo Hollow for 3 more weeks, but I never went back to the pine grove. During the day, I stuck to the main trails and well-traveled areas. At night, I locked myself in my cabin and tried not to listen to the sounds from the forest. Because they were there, voices calling my name, sometimes sounding distressed, sometimes angry, sometimes seductive, and not just my voice anymore. I heard Tara calling for help, Tom reporting emergencies that didn't exist, even my ex-girlfriend from college asking me to come find her. The forest had learned more than just my voice. It was learning everything about me, my memories, my relationships, my fears, and it was using that knowledge to try to lure me back. On my last night at Echo Hollow, I finally gave in to temptation and answered one of the calls. David, my mother's voice had been calling from the woods for hours. David, honey, I'm lost. I need you to help me find my way. My mother had been dead for 6 years. I opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. I know what you are. I called into the darkness. And I know you're not my mother. Of course, I'm your mother, the voice replied, full of hurt and confusion. Don't you recognize my voice? I'm scared, David. This place is so dark, and I can't find my way home. My mother is home, I said firmly. She's been home for 6 years. I'm home, the voice said, and now it sounded different, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. This is my home now, David. And it could be yours too. We could be together again. No, you can't leave, the voice said, and it was no longer my mother's voice. It was mine again, but cold and angry. You know too much. You've seen too much. The forest won't let you go. Watch me. I went back inside, packed my gear, and drove out of Echo Hollow that very night. I requested an immediate transfer and was assigned to a forest in Montana, 2,000 miles away from anything that had ever heard my voice. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees, I hear echoes of that place. Voices calling my name, promises of belonging and purpose, threats of pursuit. The forest remembers everything, and some memories are too strong to be contained by geography. I've been in Montana for 3 years now, and I've never had any experiences like what happened at Echo Hollow. But I've learned to be careful about where I go and what I say when I'm alone in the woods. Because voices carry, and you never know what might be listening. The thing wearing Sarah Donovan's face knocked on my cabin door at exactly 3:17 a.m. I know the precise time because I've been lying awake staring at the clock, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that had been plaguing me for weeks. Working alone in Ravens Hollow Wildlife Preserve was taking its toll. 4 months of isolation broken only by occasional supply drops and radio check-ins with a main office 50 miles away. The knocking was soft, tentative, the way someone might knock when they weren't sure if anyone was home. But there shouldn't have been anyone within 30 miles of my cabin. The preserve was closed to the public for the winter, and I was the only ranger assigned to this remote section. "Hello." A woman's voice called through the door. "Is anyone there?" "I'm lost." I grabbed my robe and flashlight, then approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I could see a woman standing on my porch. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and wearing a hiking outfit that looked expensive but impractical for the current weather conditions. What struck me immediately was how clean she looked. No mud on her boots, no signs of having traveled through the rough terrain that surrounded my cabin. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," I called through the door. "How did you get here?" "I was hiking with friends," she replied, her voice shaking with what sounded like fear or cold. "We got separated in the storm yesterday. I've been walking all night trying to find help." There hadn't been any storm yesterday. The weather had been clear and cold, typical for late November in this part of the mountains. But something about her distress seemed genuine, and my training as a ranger kicked in. Lost hikers were a serious matter, regardless of the circumstances. I unlocked the door and opened it, keeping the chain engaged. "What's your name, miss?" "Sarah Donovan," she said, stepping closer to the gap in the door. "Please, I'm so cold and scared. Can I come in?" That's when I saw her eyes. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. No iris, no sclera, just solid black that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight without reflecting anything back. When she smiled at me, I could see that her teeth were too sharp, too numerous, filling her mouth like a shark's. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. "Sir," she called, her voice still maintaining that lost hiker tone. "Sir, please don't leave me out here. I need help." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the window, I could see her silhouette on the porch, standing perfectly still. She wasn't shivering despite claiming to be cold, wasn't shifting her weight, or showing any of the natural movements of someone who'd been hiking through difficult terrain all night. "I know you're in there," she said, and now her voice was different, flatter, without the emotion she'd been projecting before. "I can hear your heartbeat. I can smell your fear." I grabbed my radio and tried to raise the main office, but got nothing but static. The landline was dead too, not unusual during winter storms, but as I'd noted, there hadn't been any storms. I checked my cell phone, but the screen showed no signal, which was normal for this remote location. The knocking resumed, but now it was coming from multiple points: the front door, the back door, the windows. Impossible unless there were several people outside. But when I peered through different windows, I saw the same woman at each location, wearing the same clothes, making the same knocking motions in perfect synchronization. "Let me in, Evan," she called from what sounded like every direction at once. "I know you're lonely out here. I know you miss human contact. I can be whatever you need me to be." How did she know my name? "We've been watching you for weeks," she continued, as if reading my thoughts. "You talk to yourself when you think no one can hear. You practice conversations with people who aren't there. You're going a little crazy from the isolation, aren't you? It was true. The loneliness of this assignment had been getting to me more than I'd wanted to admit. I started talking to myself, creating imaginary scenarios where I had company, sometimes even setting two places at the dinner table out of habit. I can fix that, the Seraphim said. I can be your companion, your friend, your lover, if you want. All you have to do is let me in. What are you? I shouted through the door. I'm what you need, she replied. I'm what everyone needs eventually. I'm the end of loneliness. The knocking stopped. For several minutes, there was complete silence. I moved from window to window, but saw no sign of the woman or women or whatever they had been. The porch was empty, showing no footprints in the light snow that had fallen earlier in the week. I was starting to think I'd imagined the entire encounter. Maybe the isolation really was affecting my mental state when I heard a voice from inside the cabin. Thank you for letting me in, Sarah Donovan said from behind me. I spun around to find her standing in my living room, somehow having entered without opening any doors or windows. She looked exactly as she had on the porch, except now I could see that her hiking clothes were stained with something dark that might have been blood. How did you? You invited me in, she said with that shark-toothed smile. You wanted company so badly that you practically pulled me through the walls with your need. I backed toward the kitchen, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. That's not possible, isn't it? She began to move toward me, and I noticed that her feet weren't quite touching the floor. She glided rather than walked, maintaining the same distance between us no matter how fast I moved. You've been inviting me in for months, Evan. Every night when you wish someone would knock on your door. Every morning when you hope to find another person on your rounds. Every moment when you imagine what it would be like to have a companion. You're not real. I'm as real as your loneliness, as real as your fear, as real as your desperate need for human contact. She was close enough now that I could smell her, not perfume or soap, but something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. And I'm here to fulfill that need. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and brandished it at her. Stay back. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Iron and steel. You humans always think metal can solve your problems. But I'm not something you can cut, Evan. I'm not something physical that can be killed. Then what are you? I'm hunger, she said simply. I'm the thing that lives in empty spaces, that feeds on isolation and despair. Your kind created me by being alone too much, by wanting connection so desperately that you called something to fill the void. The knife passed through her as if she were made of smoke when I tried to strike her. But I felt something, a cold that burned like fire, spreading up my arm from where the blade had made contact. I don't want to hurt you, she said, sounding almost sad. I want to help you. I want to be your perfect companion. As she spoke, her appearance began to change. Her hair became lighter, her features softer. She was transforming into someone I recognized, Jenny Morrison, my ex-girlfriend who'd broken up with me 2 years ago because she couldn't handle my career choice. I've missed you so much, Evan, she said in Jenny's voice. I was wrong to leave. I want to come back. You're not Jenny. I can be Jenny. I can be anyone you want me to be. I can fill every empty moment, satisfy every lonely thought. You'll never have to be alone again. Despite knowing what she was, I felt a powerful urge to accept her offer. The loneliness of this assignment had been crushing, and the thought of having Jenny back, even a false Jenny, was almost irresistible. All you have to do is stop fighting, she whispered, reaching out to touch my face with fingers that felt like ice. Let me in completely. Let me become part of you. Her touch sent waves of cold through my skull, and I could feel something probing at the edges of my mind. Images flashed through my thoughts. Memories of Jenny, of other relationships, of every moment of loneliness and isolation I'd ever experienced. The thing was reading me, learning how to be exactly what I wanted. With tremendous effort, I pulled away from her touch. No, you're not what I want. You're not real. Real. She laughed again, and her form began to shift back to the Sarah appearance. What's real, Evan? Your memories of people who aren't here? Your imaginary conversations? Your desperate wish for someone to care about you? She gestured around the cabin, and I saw what she meant. The place was a shrine to my isolation. Photos of friends and family I rarely spoke to anymore, mementos from a life I'd abandoned for this job, evidence of a man slowly losing touch with human connection. I'm more real than any of them, she continued. I'm here. I'm present. I want to be with you. You want to consume me. Is there a difference? Isn't that what love is? The desire to become one with another person? To never be apart. As she spoke, I became aware of movement outside the cabin. Through the windows, I could see more figures approaching. Other lost hikers, other people I might have known or wished to see. They all moved with the same gliding gait. All had the same black eyes. We're legion, Sarah said, noticing my attention. We're every lonely soul who ever wished for company, every isolated heart that called out in the darkness. And we're here to answer that call. The figures outside began pressing against the windows, their faces becoming distorted as they pushed against the glass. I recognized some of them, or thought I did. My college roommate. My high school girlfriend. My father, who died 5 years ago. Let us in, Evan, they all said in unison. Let us fill the emptiness. The windows began to crack under the pressure of their bodies. Soon they would break through, and I would be surrounded by these hungry shadows wearing familiar faces. But then I remembered something from my training, not ranger training, but something much older. My grandmother had been full of folk wisdom and old superstitions, and one thing she'd always insisted on was that certain entities couldn't enter a home without being invited. I don't invite you in, I said firmly. I revoke any invitation I may have given. You are not welcome here. The effect was immediate. Sarah's form wavered like a heat mirage, and the figures outside stopped pressing against the windows. Too late, Sarah hissed, but her voice was fainter now, less substantial. I'm already inside, but I didn't invite you in willingly, I realized. You tricked your way in by making me think you were human. That doesn't count. Semantics, she snarled, but she was definitely becoming less solid. Legal technicalities won't save you forever. Maybe not, I agreed. But they'll save me tonight. I began moving through the cabin, reinforcing the barriers, closing curtains, locking windows, checking doors. With each action, the entities became fainter, their voices more distant. This isn't over, Sarah called as she faded. You can't stay barricaded forever. Eventually, you'll have to come outside. Eventually, the loneliness will call to us again. Maybe, I said, but not tonight. She vanished to the sound like wind through dry leaves, and the figures outside melted away into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair with my back to the wall, watching the windows and doors for any sign of movement. But the entities didn't return, at least not that night. When morning came, I packed my essential gear and hiked out to where I could get a cell phone signal. I called the main office and requested immediate extraction, citing a family emergency. They had a helicopter pick me up that afternoon. I never returned to Ravens Hollow Wildlife Preserve. The official story was that I'd had a personal crisis and needed time off. I was granted extended leave and eventually transferred to a busy park near a major city, where I was never alone for more than a few minutes at a time. But I never forgot what I learned that night in the cabin. Loneliness is a dangerous thing, not just emotionally, but literally. It calls to things that live in the spaces between human contact, entities that feed on isolation and despair. Now I make sure to maintain regular contact with friends and family. I join social groups. I date, even when I'm not particularly interested in the person. I've learned that solitude, like fire, is a useful servant but a terrible master. Because sometimes, when you're alone too long and wish too hard for company, something might answer that wish. And you might not like what shows up at your door. The photographs appeared on my desk every morning for 6 straight days, and each one showed me sleeping. The first one, I almost dismissed as a prank. It was black and white, grainy, taken through the window of my ranger cabin at Pine Ridge National Forest. I was visible in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin, dead to the world. The timestamp in the corner read 3:47 a.m. from the previous night. Very funny, I muttered, assuming one of the other rangers was pulling my leg. Pine Ridge had a small crew, just four of us covering nearly 200,000 acres of wilderness, and we were known for our practical jokes during the quiet winter months. The second photograph appeared the next morning, same angle, same window, but this time the timestamp read 4:12 a.m. In this one, I'd apparently rolled over in my sleep. Someone was getting elaborate with their prank. By the third photograph, I wasn't laughing anymore. This one was taken from inside my cabin. I stared at the image, my hand shaking slightly. The photo showed me sleeping, but it was clearly taken from the foot of my bed, looking down at me. The angle was perfect, the focus sharp, and the timestamp read 2:33 a.m. from the night before. I'd locked all my doors and windows before going to bed. I always did. 12 years as a ranger had taught me to be security conscious, especially in remote locations. There was no way someone could have entered my cabin without waking me, and definitely no way they could have taken a photograph with a flash without disturbing my sleep. But more disturbing than the logistics was something else I noticed in the photo. In the background, barely visible in the shadows near my bedroom door, there was a shape. Tall, thin, motionless. It looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. Too elongated, too angular. I called the Pine Ridge main office immediately. "Rachel, it's Luke. I need to report a possible break-in." Rachel Kane's voice crackled through the radio. "Break-in? What's missing?" "Nothing's missing. Someone's been taking photographs of me while I sleep." A pause. "Someone's been what?" I explained about the photos, leaving out the detail about the figure in the background. Rachel was practical to a fault, and I didn't want her to think I was losing my grip on reality. "Could be kids from town," she suggested. "You know how teenagers like to mess with authority figures. Want me to send Caleb over to check things out?" "Yeah, that would be good." Caleb Mercer arrived that afternoon, bringing his expertise in tracking and investigation. He'd been a ranger for nearly 20 years and had dealt with everything from poachers to serial vandals. If anyone could figure out who was playing photographer with my sleep schedule, it would be him. We spent 3 hours examining my cabin and the surrounding area. Caleb found no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow around the building, no evidence that anyone had been anywhere near the place. "It's like whoever did this was a ghost," he said, scratching his gray beard. "No tracks, no tool marks on the locks, no disturbed vegetation around the windows. Either you're dealing with the most professional stalker in the world, or what?" He shrugged. "Or you're sleepwalking and taking pictures of yourself." It was a theory, but it didn't explain the figure in the third photograph. That night, I set up every security measure I could think of. I wedged chairs under the door handles, strung fishing line across the windows that would make noise if disturbed, and even scattered flour on the floor near my bed to show footprints. I kept my service weapon loaded and within easy reach. Despite my precautions, I slept better than I had in weeks. Maybe it was the reassurance of the security measures, or maybe it was exhaustion from days of poor sleep and mounting anxiety. The fourth photograph was waiting for me in the morning. This one was taken from directly above my bed, as if the photographer had been floating near the ceiling. The image showed me sleeping peacefully, surrounded by all my security measures, the chairs still wedged under doors, the fishing line intact, the flour on the floor undisturbed. But again, there was a figure in the background. This time it was clearer, more defined. Tall and impossibly thin, standing in the corner of my bedroom like a living shadow. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying me with the detached interest of a scientist observing a lab specimen. I stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The security measures hadn't been disturbed, which meant either someone had incredible skill at moving through the cabin without leaving traces, or the photographer wasn't entirely physical. That afternoon, I drove into the nearest town and bought every piece of surveillance equipment I could afford: motion sensors, infrared cameras, digital recorders. If something was visiting my cabin at night, I was going to document it properly. The equipment took most of the evening to set up, but by bedtime I had my cabin wired like a fortress. Motion sensors covered every approach, cameras monitored all the rooms, and recorders would capture any sound above a whisper. I barely slept, lying in bed listening for any indication that the sensors had been triggered. But the night passed quietly, with only the normal sounds of the forest, wind in the trees, the occasional call of a night bird, the settling noises of an old wooden building. The fifth photograph showed me sleeping restlessly, tossing and turning in obvious distress. But what made my blood run cold was the timestamp. It was taken at 3:15 a.m., right in the middle of the night when all my equipment should have been monitoring everything. None of the motion sensors had been triggered. None of the cameras had recorded anything unusual. The audio recorders had captured only normal nighttime sounds. But the photograph existed, showing a figure standing not in the background this time, but right beside my bed. Close enough to touch me. Close enough that I should have felt its presence, sensed its breathing, been awakened by its proximity. The figure was clearer in this photo than in any of the others. It was definitely not human, despite its roughly humanoid shape. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow, its head too large and elongated. What I had initially taken for shadows were actually features, deep-set eyes that reflected light like an animal's, a mouth that stretched too wide across its face, fingers that ended in what looked like claws. And it was looking directly at the camera. I called in sick and spent the entire day researching everything I could find about Pine Ridge National Forest. What I discovered made me wish I'd requested a transfer months ago. The area had a history of strange disappearances going back over a century. Native American tribes had avoided the region, calling it the place where watchers dwell. Early settlers reported seeing tall, thin figures moving through the trees at night, always just at the edge of vision. Hunters spoke of feeling eyes upon them, of being followed by something that stayed just out of sight. In 1952, a family of campers had vanished from Pine Ridge without a trace. Their campsite was found intact, meals half-eaten, but no sign of the four family members. Search parties combed the area for weeks without finding so much as a piece of clothing. In 1967, a geological survey team had reported being observed by unknown entities during their work in the remote sections of the forest. They'd abandoned their project after several team members suffered what they described as psychological harassment by unseen watchers. In 1981, a group of hikers had claimed to be stalked by tall, thin figures that followed them for 3 days, never approaching directly but always present at the periphery of their vision. The pattern was consistent, people reporting the sensation of being watched, of being followed, of being studied by something non-human. Most left the area quickly and never returned. Those who stayed too long simply disappeared. That night, I didn't even pretend to try sleeping in my cabin. Instead, I packed essential gear and hiked 5 miles to an emergency shelter maintained by the Forest Service. It was a small, windowless concrete structure designed to provide refuge during severe weather, but it felt safer than my glass-walled cabin with its numerous entry points. I barricaded myself inside with enough food and water for several days and waited. The 6th photograph was slipped under the shelter door sometime during the night. This one was different from all the others. Instead of showing me sleeping, it showed me wide awake, sitting against the back wall of the shelter with my weapon drawn and my eyes wide with fear. The timestamp read 4:44 a.m., but I had no memory of that moment. As far as I knew, I'd been alert and aware all night. But the most terrifying aspect of this photograph was that there was no figure in the background. Instead, the creature was in the foreground, its elongated face filling most of the frame. It was close enough to the camera that I could see details I'd never wanted to see. The texture of its grayish skin, the way its eyes reflected light like black mirrors, the rows of needle-sharp teeth visible in its too wide mouth. And somehow impossibly, it was smiling. Written across the bottom of the photograph in spidery handwriting were the words, "We see you, Luke Stanton. We have always seen you. Soon you will see us too." I was packed and hiking out of Pine Ridge within an hour. I didn't file a formal report or request a transfer through proper channels. I simply drove to the main office, handed in my keys and radio, and told Rachel I was quitting effective immediately. When she pressed for details, I just said I'd had a family emergency that required my immediate attention. She was suspicious, but I'd been a good employee for 3 years, and she didn't push the issue. I never told anyone about the photographs. Who would believe such a story? But I kept them locked away in a safety deposit box like evidence of a crime that could never be prosecuted. For 6 months after leaving Pine Ridge, I worked odd jobs and tried to forget what had happened. I told myself it had been stress, isolation, maybe even some kind of psychological break brought on by too much time alone in the wilderness. But then I started getting mail at my new address. More photographs. These ones show me in my new apartment, going about my daily routine. Me cooking dinner. Me watching television. Me lying in bed reading. All taken from impossible angles, through walls that should have blocked any camera, from positions that no human photographer could have occupied. The watchers had followed me. I moved again, this time to a different state. The photographs continued to arrive. Always black and white, always grainy, always showing me in moments when I thought I was alone and unobserved. That was 2 years ago. I've moved 8 times since then, changed my name twice, taken jobs that require no background checks or permanent addresses. The photographs still find me. I'm writing this in a motel room in a city whose name I won't record, knowing that by tomorrow I'll need to move again. The watchers are patient, but they're also persistent. They've made it clear that distance means nothing to them, that there's nowhere I can go that will be beyond their observation. I don't know what they want. I don't know why they chose me. All I know is that somewhere, in the spaces between seen and unseen, they're always watching. And someday, when they tire of their game, I think they'll do more than just watch. The latest photograph arrived this morning. It shows me writing these very words, hunched over the motel room desk with fear etched into every line of my face. In the background, barely visible in the shadows near the door, a familiar tall, thin figure stands motionless, waiting. The screaming started at sunset on my 15th day patrolling the backcountry of Shadowmere State Forest, and it came from directly beneath my feet. I've been walking the old logging trail that cut through the heart of the forest, conducting my routine end-of-day wildlife survey, when the ground underneath me began to vibrate. At first, I thought it was a minor earthquake, not uncommon in this part of the mountains. But then the vibration became rhythmic, pulsing like a massive heartbeat, and the screaming began. It was human screaming, muffled by earth and distance, but unmistakably the sound of people in agony. Multiple voices, all crying out at once in a chorus of terror and pain that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth. I dropped to my hands and knees, pressing my ear to the ground. The screaming was definitely coming from below, maybe 10 or 15 feet down. But that was impossible. I was standing in the middle of virgin forest, miles from any human habitation. There were no basements here, no underground structures, no reason for anyone to be beneath the forest floor. The sound lasted for exactly 3 minutes, then cut off abruptly, leaving only the normal evening sounds of the forest, birds settling for the night, wind rustling through leaves, the distant call of a loon from one of the lakes. I marked the spot with my GPS and returned to the ranger station to file a report. But how do you report something like that? Heard people screaming underground in the middle of nowhere sounded like the beginning of a psychological evaluation, not a legitimate incident report. Instead, I filed a routine patrol report and made a note to investigate the area more thoroughly the next day. My supervisor, Tom Riggs, had been running Shadowmere for over 20 years. He was a practical man who dealt with every kind of wilderness emergency imaginable, from plane crashes to serial killers using the forest as a dumping ground. If anyone would know about underground structures or historical incidents in that area, it would be Tom. Tom, I said the next morning, what do you know about the old logging trail in Sector 12? Any history of mining operations, underground shelters, anything like that? He looked up from his paperwork, frowning. Sector 12? That's been wilderness since before the state acquired it. Why? I heard some strange sounds yesterday. Thought there might be an explanation. What kind of sounds? I hesitated. Like voices. Coming from underground. Tom's expression grew serious. Caleb, you've been sleeping okay? Eating regular meals? Sometimes the isolation out there can play tricks on your mind. I'm fine, Tom. I know what I heard. He studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a thick folder labeled Historical Records, Shadowmere SF. He flipped through it until he found what he was looking for. Here, he said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping. 1923 family of 6 disappeared while camping in what's now Sector 12. Search parties never found any trace of them. The headline read, "Entire family vanishes in Shadowmere Forest. No clues left behind." That's not all, Tom continued, pulling out more documents. 1934 hunting party of 4 men missing. 1947, 2 hikers vanished. 1952, family of 5 camping. 1961, group of college students on a nature expedition. All in the same general area. I felt a chill run down my spine. All missing. No bodies ever found. None. The area got a reputation after a while. People started avoiding it. By the 1970s, we stopped getting reports of disappearances because nobody was going there anymore. Until now. Until now, he agreed grimly. Caleb, I want you to be extra careful out there. Maybe take Peter with you on your next patrol. Peter Ray was the newest member of our team, fresh out of forestry school and eager to prove himself. He was a good kid, but inexperienced in the kind of situations that veteran rangers sometimes faced. Still, having backup was better than going alone. The next morning, Peter and I hiked out to Sector 12 together. I briefed him on the missing persons cases, but not on the screaming I'd heard. I wanted to see if he experienced anything unusual without me planting suggestions in his mind. We reached the spot where I'd heard the voices around midday. In the daylight, it looked like any other section of forest, tall pines and hardwoods, thick underbrush, a carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. Nothing to suggest that anything unusual had ever happened there. What exactly are we looking for? Peter asked. Anything out of the ordinary. Signs of old excavations, unusual depressions in the ground, anything that might explain where those missing people went. We spent 2 hours conducting a systematic search of the area, working in expanding circles from the point where I'd heard the screaming. Peter was thorough and methodical, examining every rock formation and fallen log that might conceal an opening. It was Peter who found it. Caleb, he called from about 50 yards away. Come look at this. He was standing next to what looked like an ordinary cluster of boulders, but when I got closer, I could see what had caught his attention. The rocks weren't natural. They'd been placed there deliberately, arranged to conceal something behind them. We worked together to move the smaller stones, revealing what looked like the entrance to a root cellar or storm shelter. It was made of field stone and mortar, clearly very old, with a heavy wooden door that was partially rotted away. This isn't on any of the maps, Peter observed. No, it's not. I examined the construction more closely. The stonework was primitive but solid, the kind of thing a homesteader might have built in the 1800s. But according to all the historical records, this area had never been settled. The door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. A foul odor wafted up from the opening, something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left to rot. Should we call it in? Peter asked. In a minute. Let me get a quick look first. I drew my flashlight and started down the steps. They were steep and narrow, carved directly into the bedrock. After about 10 feet, they opened into a larger chamber that my light couldn't fully illuminate. Jesus Christ, I whispered. The chamber was full of people. At least, it had been full of people once. Now it was full of skeletons, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows like they were sleeping. Some still wore fragments of clothing, hiking boots, pieces of camping gear, scraps of fabric that might once have been outdoor wear. But what made the scene truly horrifying was that the skeletons weren't just lying there. They were positioned as if they'd been alive when they were arranged. Some were sitting up against the walls. Others were kneeling as if in prayer. A few were reaching toward the entrance, their bony fingers stretched out desperately. Caleb. Peter's voice echoed down the stairway. You need to get up here right now. Something in his tone made me abandon my examination of the chamber and climb back up quickly. Peter was standing at the entrance, his face pale with fear. What is it? Look at the door, he said, pointing to the heavy wooden barrier that had been hanging open when we arrived. The door was closed now. It must have swung shut on its own, I said, but even as I spoke, I knew that wasn't possible. The door was too heavy, and there was no wind strong enough to move it. I grabbed the iron handle and pulled. The door didn't budge. I put my full weight into it, bracing my feet against the stone frame, but it was as if the door had been welded shut. "It's locked," I said unnecessarily. From the outside, Peter added, "Which means someone closed it while you were down there." We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. We were alone in the middle of a vast forest, miles from help, and someone or something had just trapped us at the entrance to what appeared to be a mass grave. "The radio," I said, reaching for my belt. But my radio was gone, not just turned off or broken, but physically missing from its clip. Peter checked his equipment. "Mine's gone too. And my GPS. Phone. No signal." "You." I checked my cell phone. No bars, which was normal for this remote area, but the phone itself was acting strangely. The screen kept flickering, and the battery indicator showed it was almost dead despite being fully charged that morning. A sound came from behind the closed door, a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Then voices began to murmur, too low to make out words but clearly human speech. "There's someone down there," Peter whispered. "No," I said grimly. "There's someone down there now." The murmuring grew louder, becoming more distinct. I could make out individual voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in a confused babble. Some sounded frightened, others angry. A few were crying. Then one voice rose above the others, clear and desperate. "Help us. Please, someone help us. We've been trapped down here for so long." It was a woman's voice, middle-aged, with a slight accent I couldn't place. She sounded genuinely distressed, not like someone playing a prank or trying to deceive us. "We're going to get help," I called through the door. "We're going to get you out of there." "No," the woman screamed. "Don't leave. If you leave, we'll never get out. It only opens from the outside when someone new comes." "What do you mean?" I shouted back. "The door. It locks when people go down, but it opens when new people arrive. You have to let us out before you leave, or we'll be trapped forever." Peter grabbed my arm. "Caleb, this is insane. We need to get out of here and call for backup." "How?" "Our radios are gone, our phones don't work, and we're miles from anywhere." The voices behind the door were growing more frantic. I could hear children crying now, and elderly voices pleading for help. If these were the missing persons from all those years, they'd been trapped in that underground chamber for decades. But that was impossible. No one could survive that long without food and water. "Please," the woman's voice called again. "We know how it sounds, but you have to believe us. Time moves differently down here. We're not dead, but we're not alive either. The thing that built this place feeds on us. It keeps us conscious but not living." "What thing?" I demanded. "It comes at night. It whispers to people, calls them into the forest. It shows them the door and convinces them to come down. Once you're down here, you can't die, but you can't live either. You just exist." I looked at Peter. His face was white with fear, but I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. If there was even a chance these people were telling the truth, we couldn't just walk away. "How do we open the door?" I called. "There's a lever hidden behind the loose stone to the right of the entrance. But be careful. Once it's open, the thing will know. It will try to stop you." I found the stone she was referring to. It was slightly out of alignment with the others, and when I pressed on it, it moved inward. Behind it was an iron lever, green with age and corrosion. "Peter, I need you to be ready to run," I said. "When I pull this lever, we're going to have company, and I don't think it's going to be friendly. Maybe we should." The decision was taken out of our hands. The lever moved on its own, sliding into the open position with a grinding sound of metal on stone. The door swung open, and immediately the chamber below filled with light. Not electric light, but soft, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Then people began climbing out. They moved slowly, like sleepwalkers or patients recovering from anesthesia. Men, women, children, all wearing clothes from different eras: 1920s hiking gear, 1940s camping outfits, 1960s outdoor wear. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were distant, but they were undeniably alive. The woman who'd been speaking was one of the first to emerge. She looked to be in her 40s, wearing a hiking outfit that might have been fashionable in the 1950s. When she saw us, her eyes focused for the first time. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was normal now, no longer the desperate scream we heard through the door. "We've been waiting so long for someone to find us. How many of you are there?" I asked. 43, she replied. "From over the years. The children are the hardest part. They don't understand why they can't grow up, why they're still the same age they were when they came down here." More people continue to emerge from the chamber. Entire families, groups of friends, individuals who'd been hiking alone when they'd encountered whatever force controlled this place. "We need to get you all to safety," I said. "There's a ranger station about 15 miles from here." "No," the woman said firmly. "We can't leave. Not yet. It won't let us." "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, the temperature around us dropped dramatically. Our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and the trees around the clearing began to creak and groan as if subjected to tremendous pressure. "It's coming," one of the rescued people whispered. "It knows we're free." The phosphorescent glow from the chamber began to dim, replaced by a different kind of light, a pulsing reddish illumination that seemed to come from the forest itself. The trees began to move, not swaying in wind, but actually shifting position, their trunks bending and twisting to form a barrier around the clearing. "What is it?" Peter asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We don't know," the woman replied. "It's old. Older than the forest. Older than anything human. It feeds on consciousness, not death, but the awareness of being trapped, helpless, unable to escape. It built this chamber as a kind of a storage facility." The reddish light grew brighter, and I could see shapes moving between the twisted trees. They were roughly humanoid but wrong in fundamental ways. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in directions that should have been impossible. "How do we fight it?" I demanded. "You don't fight it," said a new voice. An elderly man wearing 1930s camping gear stepped forward. "You give it what it wants, which is fresh consciousness, new minds to add to its collection. It will take some of us and let the others go. That's how it's always worked." "No," I said firmly. "We're all getting out of here." "Young man," the elderly man said gently, "I've been down in that chamber for 90 years. I've seen dozens of rescue attempts. The thing that controls this place is older than human civilization. It cannot be defeated by determination or weapons or modern technology." The shapes between the trees were getting closer, and I could see them more clearly now. They were definitely not human, despite their roughly human proportions. Their skin was bark-like, rough and textured, and their faces were blank except for eyes that glowed with the same reddish light that pulsed through the forest. "However," the old man continued, "it can be bargained with. It understands exchange, sacrifice. If some of us willingly return to the chamber, it will allow the others to leave." "I won't sacrifice anyone," I said. "Even to save the children?" I looked around the group of rescued people and saw several children among them. Kids who'd been camping with their families decades ago and had remained children all this time, trapped in existence that was neither life nor death. "There has to be another way." "There is," said Peter quietly. I turned to look at him. He was staring at the approaching creatures with an expression I couldn't read. "What do you mean?" "I've been reading about this place," he said. "Old folklore, Native American legends. They talk about a guardian spirit that was corrupted, turned into something hungry and malevolent. But the legends also say it can be returned to its original state." "How?" "By willingly taking its place. Someone has to volunteer to become the new guardian, to take on the responsibility of protecting the forest instead of feeding on it." The creatures had stopped at the edge of the clearing, forming a circle around us. They stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. "That's not a solution," I said. "That's just substituting one prison for another." "Maybe," Peter agreed. "But it would free everyone else. And maybe over time, a human guardian could find a way to break the cycle entirely." "Peter, no. I'm the newest ranger, Caleb. I don't have family depending on me, no wife or kids. And I knew when I took this job that I might have to make sacrifices to protect people." Before I could stop him, Peter stepped forward toward the circle of creatures. "I volunteer," he called out. "I offer myself as guardian in exchange for their freedom." The creature's eyes flared brighter, and a sound filled the air. Not quite voice, not quite wind, but something that conveyed meaning directly to the mind. The offer is acceptable. The exchange will be made. No. I lunged forward to grab Peter, but he was already changing. His skin took on a bark-like texture. His limbs began to elongate, and his eyes started to glow with that same reddish light. "Take them home, Caleb," he said, his voice already sounding different, more distant. "And don't come back here. This place is my responsibility now." The creatures began to withdraw into the forest, and the twisted trees straightened back to their normal positions. The reddish light faded, replaced by normal late-afternoon sunlight. Peter was gone, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human but was still, somehow, recognizably him. "Come on," I said to the rescued people. "Let's get you out of here." The hike back to the ranger station took 6 hours. We moved slowly because many of the rescued people were weak and disoriented, but we made it without incident. I called for medical assistance and federal backup, and within hours the area was swarming with ambulances, FBI agents, and various government officials. The rescued people were taken to hospitals for evaluation and treatment. Remarkably, despite having been trapped for decades in some cases, they were all in good physical health. Psychologically, they would need extensive counseling, but they were alive and free. I filed my report, telling as much of the truth as I thought anyone would believe. I said Peter had fallen into a sinkhole while we were investigating the underground chamber, and that his body hadn't been recovered. The lie tasted bitter, but what was the alternative? That he'd sacrificed himself to become the guardian spirit of a haunted forest? The chamber was sealed with concrete and marked as a hazardous area. The entire sector was closed to the public indefinitely. Officially, it was due to unstable geological conditions. Unofficially, it was to prevent anyone else from stumbling across whatever was still lurking in those woods. I requested a transfer and was reassigned to a busy park near a major city. Urban problems were something I could handle. Drunk teenagers, litterbugs, the occasional drug dealer. Nothing that required sacrificing a good man to ancient horrors. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees, I think I can hear Peter's voice carried on the breeze. He sounds peaceful, content even, as if he's found purpose in his new role as guardian. I hope that's true. I hope his sacrifice meant something, that he's protecting other people from the fate that befell those 43 souls who spent decades trapped beneath the earth. But I know I'll never go back to find out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some guardians are better left undisturbed. The first rule of working alone in remote wilderness areas is that you never really work alone. Something is always watching you. Usually it's wildlife, deer observing your movements, birds tracking your progress, predators evaluating whether you're a threat or potential prey. After 8 years as a park ranger, I'd grown comfortable with this constant surveillance. The forest had its own rhythms and intelligence, and I'd learned to move within them respectfully. But the things watching me in the Bleakwood Preserve were different. I'd been assigned to Bleakwood 3 weeks earlier, taking over for Sarah Donovan, who'd requested an emergency transfer after less than 2 months on the job. The preserve was small by wilderness standards, only 40 square miles of old-growth forest tucked into a remote valley, but it had a reputation for being difficult to staff. In the past 5 years, 7 different rangers had been assigned to the area. None had lasted longer than 6 months. "It's just isolated," Tom Riggs had assured me during my briefing. "Some people can't handle being alone that much. But you've got experience with solo assignments." That was true. I'd worked remote postings before and actually preferred them to the busier parks where you spent more time dealing with tourists than with nature. Solitude didn't bother me, or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came on my 4th day, during what should have been a routine perimeter patrol. I was hiking the northern boundary trail when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of pale color among the dark tree trunks. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. This happened several more times over the course of the hike. Always the same, a glimpse of something pale and tall moving just at the edge of my vision, vanishing the moment I tried to focus on it. I attributed it to fatigue or I strain. The filtered light of the deep forest could play tricks on anyone. But that night, alone in the ranger cabin, I found myself jumping at every sound. The normal nighttime noises of the forest, wind in the trees, the call of owls, the rustle of small animals, seemed amplified and threatening. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin, but when I turned on the outside lights and looked through the windows, I saw nothing. The second incident occurred a week later. I was conducting a wildlife survey in the preserve's eastern section when I became aware of being followed. It wasn't like the usual sense of animal observation. This felt more intentional, more focused. Something was tracking me specifically, matching my pace and staying just out of sight. I stopped frequently, listening and watching, but never saw anything concrete. Just occasional glimpses of movement, always pale, always tall, always vanishing when I tried to get a clear look. That evening, I called the main office and spoke with Rachel Kane, the regional supervisor. Rachel, what do you know about the history of Bleakwood Preserve? Standard conservation area, she replied. Old-growth forests, minimal human impact. Why? I'm seeing things. Or thinking I'm seeing things. Movement in the trees, like someone's watching me. A pause. Wildlife? I don't think so. Too tall, too coordinated. Lucy, you've been alone out there for over a week. Sometimes isolation can cause hallucinations, especially in dense forest environments. Maybe you should come back to town for a few days. I'm fine, I insisted, though I wasn't sure that was true. I just wanted to know if there was any history of unusual incidents in the area. Nothing official. But she hesitated. Sarah Donovan mentioned similar things before she transferred out, and Marcus Webb before her. They both reported feeling watched, seeing movement that didn't make sense. What did you tell them? The same thing I'm telling you. Take breaks, maintain contact with other people, don't let the isolation get to you. But it wasn't isolation causing my experiences, it was something in the forest itself. The third incident convinced me of that. I was doing maintenance on one of the trail markers deep in the preserve when I heard voices. Human voices, speaking in low tones just beyond my range of hearing. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, pushing through thick underbrush toward what seemed to be a clearing ahead. But when I reached the space between the trees, I found something that made my rational mind rebel against what I was seeing. They were standing in a perfect circle around a small open area, 12 figures, each about 7 feet tall, impossibly pale and thin. They were roughly humanoid in shape but wrong in every detail. Their skin was the color of bleached bone, stretched tight over frames that seemed too large for their bodies. Their arms hung nearly to their knees, ending in hands with too many fingers. Their faces were the worst part, completely blank except for large, black eyes that reflected no light. They were all facing inward toward the center of the circle, where something was writhing in the dirt. As I watched, transfixed with horror, I realized it was a deer, still alive but obviously dying, its movements growing weaker as whatever the pale figures were doing to it continued. One of the figures turned its head toward me. Not its body, just its head, rotating nearly 180 degrees while the rest of it remained motionless. When those black eyes fixed on me, I felt a cold that seemed to reach directly into my bones. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my only thought to get as far away from that clearing as possible. Behind me, I could hear something following, not footsteps exactly, but a sound like wind through dry leaves, getting closer. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, and I didn't stop driving until I was back at the cabin. Once inside, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and sat in the center of the main room with my back to the wall and my service weapon in my lap. That's when I started researching the real history of Bleakwood Preserve. The official records were sparse, but local newspaper archives told a different story. Dating back to the 1800s, there were reports of strange sightings in what was now the preserve. Loggers spoke of pale watchers that observed their work from the tree line. Hunters reported finding animal carcasses arranged in ritualistic patterns. Native American tribes in the area had legends about tall, thin spirits that fed on life force itself. But the most disturbing discovery was a pattern of disappearances. Every few years, someone would go missing in or near the preserve. Hikers, hunters, even local residents who lived on the preserve's borders. They would simply vanish, leaving no trace except occasionally their abandoned vehicles. What connected all these disappearances was the timing. They always occurred during the new moon, when the forest was at its darkest. I checked my calendar and felt my blood turn to ice water. The next new moon was in 3 days. I should have left then. I should have packed my gear and driven straight back to the main office, requesting immediate transfer and someone else's problem. But something kept me there, not bravery or duty, but a growing certainty that running wouldn't solve anything. If these things, whatever they were, had been hunting in this area for over a century, they weren't going to stop just because I left. They would continue taking people, and eventually another ranger would be assigned to investigate. I couldn't pass this responsibility to someone else. So I stayed and I prepared. I spent the next 2 days turning the ranger cabin into a fortress. I boarded up all the windows except for small observation ports, reinforced the doors, and created multiple defensive positions throughout the building. I inventoried my ammunition and improvised additional weapons from tools and camp equipment. Most importantly, I documented everything. I wrote detailed reports of my encounters, recorded video testimonials, and prepared evidence packages that would automatically be sent to Rachel Kane if I failed to check in by a specific time. If something happened to me, at least someone would know the truth about Bleakwood Preserve. The Pale Watchers came for me on the night of the new moon. I first became aware of their presence around midnight, when the forest went completely silent. No insects, no night birds, no rustle of small animals, just absolute quiet, as if every living thing in the preserve was holding its breath. Then I saw lights moving between the trees. Not flashlights or lanterns, but cold, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the watchers themselves. Through my observation ports, I could see them approaching the cabin from all directions, moving with that same eerie gliding motion I'd witnessed in the clearing. They stopped about 50 feet from the building, forming a circle around it. In the pale light they gave off, I could see them clearly for the first time. They were even more disturbing up close. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid, their black eyes too large and too knowing. One of them stepped forward and spoke. Its voice was like the sound of wind through dry bones. "Lucy Fallon, we have been watching you." "I know," I called back, surprised that my voice was steady. "I've seen you. You have seen us see you. Few humans notice our observation. This makes you interesting. What do you want?" "We want what we have always wanted. To feed. To continue. To maintain the balance." "What balance?" "Life and death. Growth and decay. We take what is needed to preserve what remains. We are gardeners, and this forest is our garden." I understood then. They weren't random predators or malevolent spirits. They were something older and more fundamental. They were part of the forest ecosystem, as natural as wolves or bears, but operating on a level that human science couldn't measure or understand. "The people you've taken," I said, "were they part of maintaining this balance? Each feeding allows the forest to continue for many years. Without our intervention, the entire ecosystem would collapse. We take few to preserve many, but you're killing innocent people. We take the dying, the lost, the abandoned, those whose life force is already weakening. We simply accelerate the process." It was a rationalization, but I could hear something like sincerity in the creature's voice. From their perspective, they were performing a necessary function, culling the weak to strengthen the whole. "And now you want to take me? Your life force is strong, Bright. A feeding on one such as you would sustain the forest for many seasons. What if I said no?" Saying no is not an option humans possess in this matter. But dying with awareness is preferable to dying in ignorance. They began to move closer to the cabin, their phosphorescent glow growing brighter. I could feel something probing at my mind, not reading my thoughts exactly, but evaluating my spirit, measuring the strength of my life force. However, the speaker continued, "We are not without mercy. We offer you choice in the manner of your passing. What kind of choice? You may come with us willingly, and your death will be swift and painless. Or you may resist, and your death will be educational. For us." I looked around the cabin I'd turned into a fortress and realized that all my preparations were meaningless. These things operated by rules I didn't understand, using methods that physical barriers couldn't stop. They could probably walk through the walls if they wanted to. But they were offering me a choice, which suggested they did have limits, constraints that governed their behavior. I have a counter-proposal, I said. The Pale Watchers stopped moving. Speed. I understand your function here. You maintain the forest's balance by taking life force when needed. But what if there was another way to strengthen the ecosystem? What if I helped you find an alternative to killing people? There is no alternative. Life force cannot be created, only transferred, but it can be given willingly, in smaller amounts over time. Instead of taking one person's entire life force, what if you took small portions from many people? Volunteers who understood what they were contributing to. The Watchers were silent for a long moment, and I could feel them communicating with each other in ways that didn't involve speech. This has not been attempted, the speaker finally said. But it's possible, theoretically. But it would require a human intermediary. Someone to coordinate the donations. Someone who understood both worlds. Someone like a park ranger. Yes, someone like a park ranger. I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to fundamentally change my life. I volunteer for the position. You would become our agent among humans. Part of our garden, but retaining your human form and consciousness. It would alter you. How? You would live longer than normal humans, but you would never again be entirely human. You would feel our hunger as your own, see through our eyes, understand our purpose as if it were your own. It wasn't really a choice, serve them willingly or die unwillingly. But maybe as their agent, I could find ways to minimize the harm they cause, to protect people while still maintaining whatever cosmic balance they represented. I accept. The Pale Watchers moved closer, and their glow intensified until it was almost blinding. I felt something enter my mind, not forcefully, like an invasion, but gently, like water soaking into soil. Knowledge flowed into me, understanding of the forest's deeper rhythms, awareness of the connections between all living things, perception of the energy flows that sustain the ecosystem. But with the knowledge came hunger. A deep, gnawing need for life force that felt like starvation and thirst combined. I understood now why the Watchers fed, not from cruelty, but from necessity as fundamental as breathing. When the glow faded, the Watchers were gone. I was alone in the cabin, but I was no longer entirely human. I could feel every living thing in the forest, every bird, every insect, every plant. And I could sense the overall health of the ecosystem, the places where it was strong and the places where it was failing. Over the following weeks, I developed a new approach to managing Bleakwood Preserve. I started a volunteer program, carefully selecting people who were drawn to the forest and explaining to them the importance of contributing to its health. I didn't tell them about the Pale Watchers, but I taught them meditation techniques that allowed them to share small portions of their life force willingly. It worked. The forest grew stronger, and the Watchers' hunger was satisfied without anyone dying. The volunteer program expanded, drawing people from around the region who felt called to contribute to something larger than themselves. I've been the liaison between the Pale Watchers and humanity for 3 years now. It's not an easy job, the hunger never goes away, and sometimes I struggle with the knowledge of what I've become. But no one has disappeared from Bleakwood Preserve since I took on this role. The Watchers still observe everyone who enters their domain, but now they do so with patience rather than predatory intent. They have their human agent to provide what they need, and they honor our agreement. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if I made the right choice. I gave up my humanity to save lives, but in doing so, I became something that most people would consider monstrous. I'm sustained by the life force of volunteers. I can see in the dark, and I no longer age at a normal rate. But the forest thrives, the ecosystem remains balanced, and people can enjoy the beauty of Bleakwood Preserve without fear. For now, that's enough. The Pale Watchers are patient, and they understand long-term planning in ways that humans struggle to comprehend. They're content with our arrangement because it ensures their survival and the forest's health for generations to come. And I'm content because I found a way to protect people while serving a purpose larger than myself. Even if that purpose sometimes makes me question what I've become. The last rays of sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in angry hues of orange and bruised purple. I watched it from the worn porch of Ranger Station Gamma, a solitary speck in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Blackwood National Forest. My name is Elias Thorne, and for the past 5 years, this wilderness has been my office, my sanctuary, and increasingly my tormentor. Tonight, the wind carried a different kind of chill. Not just the bite of approaching winter, but something deeper, an ancient cold that seemed to hum in the very bones of the forest. The usual chorus of crickets and distant owl hoots was muted, replaced by an unsettling hush that pressed in on all sides. Even the mighty pines, usually whispering secrets in the breeze, stood silent, their shadows stretching long and skeletal over the uneven terrain. My shift was technically over, but a gnawing dread kept me from settling in. It started a few days ago with the missing hikers, a young couple, ambitious and ill-prepared, who'd veered off the marked trails into the notoriously difficult Petrified Woods section. Search and rescue had gone in, came back empty-handed, and now the official word was presumed lost. But something about the incident felt wrong. Their car was still in the parking lot, their gear accounted for, save for their backpacks and a single tattered map. No signs of struggle, no discarded items, just gone. Then came the calls from the few cabins scattered around the perimeter. Whispers of strange lights, of distant, unearthly keening sounds echoing through the night, of animal behavior gone erratic. Old Man Hemlock, who'd lived here longer than the trees themselves, swore he saw things moving among the petrified trunks, things that weren't deer or bear. He called them shadow weavers. I'd humored him as always, chalking it up to age and the isolation playing tricks. But the collective unease was starting to seep into my own bones. Tonight, the air was thick with it. I grabbed my flashlight, my worn leather-bound journal, and my old .30-06. Just a perimeter check. I muttered to myself, the words sounding hollow even in the quiet of the station. Clear my head. The trail into the petrified woods was barely more than a deer path, overgrown and treacherous. It was forbidden to hikers for a reason. The trees here weren't just old. They were geological anomalies, ancient sequoias that had turned to stone millennia ago, their rings still visible, their gnarled branches reaching like fossilized claws into the sky. They stood as silent, gray sentinels, an ossified forest within a living one, and locals whispered that time itself bent and warped within their stony confines. As I ventured deeper, the living forest receded, replaced entirely by the spectral gray giants. The ground underfoot shifted from pine needles to a strange, gritty dust, like powdered stone. The air grew colder, stiller. The wind, which had been a gentle murmur outside, vanished completely here, leaving an oppressive silence that screamed in my ears. My breath plumed in the frigid air, a stark contrast to the oppressive lack of life around me. No birds, no insects, just the occasional faint clink as a loose pebble rolled across the stony ground. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, casting long, distorted shadows of the petrified trunks. They seemed to writhe and stretch, like petrified demons caught mid-transformation. I kept my senses sharp, my hand never far from the rifle sling. My training told me it was just my imagination, fueled by the unsettling quiet and the missing hikers. But my gut, the instinct that had kept me alive in this wild country, screamed otherwise. Suddenly a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible thump. It came from my left, deeper within the petrified maze. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy. And then another thump. And another rhythmic and slow, like something immense dragging itself across the stone. Hello. I called out, my voice swallowed by the silence, sounding ridiculously small and vulnerable. Ranger Thorne, is anyone out here? The thumping stopped. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight swept frantically through the petrified columns, searching for any sign, any movement. Nothing. Just the endless, silent stone. Then a whisper. It wasn't a human voice. It was like dry leaves skittering across stone, or sand being sifted by an unseen hand. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, brushing against my ears, raising goosebumps on my arms. I couldn't make out words, just a sibilant dry hiss that spoke of age and dust. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else, something that felt profoundly wrong. I started moving, not deeper, but attempting to circle back towards the familiar green of the living forest. My steps were slow, deliberate, my eyes darting between the towering stone trees. The whispering intensified, seemingly coalescing behind me, drawing closer with each agonizing step. It wasn't just a sound now. It felt like a presence, cold and ancient, breathing down my neck. Then I saw them. Not shadow weavers, not physical beings, but impressions. Faint, shimmering outlines in the air between the petrified trees, like heat haze but colder, like the ghost of a human form. They flickered, indistinct and horrifying, just at the edge of my vision. As I tried to focus on them, they would dissolve, only to reappear a few feet away. Panic began to rise. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was not the Blackwood I knew. I quickened my pace, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the freezing air. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a faint, high-pitched scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across rough stone. The phantom shapes multiplied, swirling around me, their ghostly forms overlapping, forming a macabre, silent dance. Suddenly, the ground under my foot felt different. Not gritty stone dust, but something soft. I looked down, my flashlight beam revealing not the familiar gray, but a patch of dark, freshly disturbed earth. And embedded in it, clearly visible, was a single, muddy hiking boot. It was the same brand, the same color, as the boots the missing hiker Sarah had been wearing. My breath hitched. This was too real. I knelt, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs, and reached out to touch the boot. Before my fingers could make contact, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the air, shaking the very ground beneath me. The petrified trees around me seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and the ghostly forms solidified, their edges sharper, their movements more defined. They were still indistinct, like figures seen through distorting glass, but I could make out limbs, the vague suggestion of heads. And they were all facing me. Their forms were elongated, unnaturally thin, their faces featureless, like smooth, polished stone. The hum intensified, filling my head, making my teeth ache. The scratching sound became a chorus, 1,000 nails on 1,000 slate boards. I saw, not with my eyes, but with some deeper sense, the figures reaching out, their long spectral fingers stretching towards me, towards the boot. No. I scrambled back, dropping my flashlight. It hit the ground with a dull clatter, the beam spinning wildly, illuminating the horror around me in chaotic flashes. The figures seemed to recoil from the light, their forms flickering, but their presence remained. My hand instinctively went to my rifle. I fumbled with the safety, my fingers trembling. What good would a bullet do against this? Then I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible whimper, coming from directly under the earth where the boot lay. It was a human sound. A terrified, choked sob. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice raw. The spectral forms surged forward, their whispers now a deafening roar of dry, rustling sound. They were trying to get to me, or to whatever was beneath the earth. Their stony hands clawed at the air, stirring up the ancient dust. I had a choice, run or try to understand. The whimper decided it. There was still a chance. Ignoring the terrifying figures, I grabbed my entrenching tool from my pack. It was stupid, suicidal, but I couldn't leave someone out here. I started to dig frantically around the boot. The ground was surprisingly soft, crumbling easily despite the stony surroundings. Each scoop sent tremors of dread through me. The hum grew deafening. The air crackled with a frigid energy. The spectral forms lunged closer, their forms momentarily solidifying into grotesque, featureless statues, their hands reaching. I could almost feel the cold seeping through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. As I dug, the boot came loose, revealing not a leg, but a section of a backpack. And then a hand. Small, pale, and unmistakably human. It was Sarah's. But it wasn't just a hand. It was a petrified. Gray, stony, frozen mid-grasp, as if she had tried to pull herself free of something before she turned to stone. My stomach churned. This wasn't some quick disappearance. This was a transformation. The hum reached a crescendo, and the very ground beneath me vibrated. The petrified trees around us seemed to lean in, their ancient forms groaning. The shadowy figures coalesced into a single, immense, towering presence directly behind Sarah's petrified hand. It was an entity composed of pure shadow and the dust of ages, its form indistinct but undeniably vast and malevolent. It had no face, no discernible features, but I felt its focus, its ancient hunger, directed squarely at me. And then a sensation akin to an electric shock ripped through my body. My limbs began to stiffen, a strange, creeping numbness spreading from my fingertips. I felt my skin growing cold, my muscles seizing. It was like I was turning to stone, just like Sarah. My vision blurred. The towering shadow expanded, consuming everything. I tried to scream, but my throat was constricting, my jaw locked. The last thing I saw, as the petrification crept higher, was the faint, desperate glimmer of my flashlight, still spinning on the ground, its beam cutting a frantic, final dance through the horrifying gloom of the petrified woods. I don't know how long I was there, trapped halfway between flesh and stone. Moments? Hours? Eternity? The cold was absolute, the silence deafening, punctuated only by the spectral hum that had become part of my very being. I was aware, painfully so, of the transformation, of the world fading, turning to gray, becoming inert. Then a flicker, a warmth, distant, almost imperceptible. It was the rising sun, pushing its way through the dense canopy, filtering down into the petrified woods. The hum lessened. The crushing pressure eased. The numbness began to recede, agonizingly slowly, replaced by a searing pain as blood rushed back into frozen veins. The towering shadow entity seemed to shrink, its presence lessening, pulled back by the encroaching light. I gasped a ragged, painful sound, as if I was drawing my first breath. My eyes snapped open, blurry but seeing. The ghostly figures were gone, dissolved into the faint morning mist that clung to the stone trees. The overwhelming sense of malevolence had receded, leaving only the lingering chill and the oppressive silence. I lay there for a long time, shivering uncontrollably, my muscles screaming in protest. My hand still clutched the entrenching tool. The muddy boot and Sarah's petrified hand were still there, half buried, horrifyingly real. I managed to push myself up, every movement an effort. My skin felt stiff, raw, as if I'd been flayed. I stared at Sarah's hand. The sunlight caught the stony texture, making it look eerily lifelike, yet utterly dead. She hadn't just died here. She had become part of this place. I stumbled back, tripping over roots, desperate to get away. The silence of the petrified woods felt different now. Not just oppressive, but predatory, like a beast waiting for nightfall. I knew with absolute certainty that this place was alive in some ancient, horrific way, and it fed on those who strayed too deep. I didn't stop until I burst out of the petrified section, gasping for breath, into the blessed green of the living forest. The familiar rustle of leaves, the chirping of early morning birds, the smell of pine, it all felt like a lifeline, a desperate connection to the sane world. I didn't look back. I just ran. Back at the station, my uniform was torn, my face streaked with dirt and tears. I looked into the cracked mirror above my sink. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, reflecting a terror I hadn't known was possible. But it was my hands that horrified me the most. They were still pale, and in the faintest light, I could almost imagine a subtle gray tinge to the skin, a faint stony texture. I tried to write down what happened in my journal. My hand trembled so violently I could barely hold the pen. The words blurred, becoming illegible. How could I explain this? Who would believe me? They'd say I was mad, that the isolation had finally gotten to me. I looked at the map on my wall, my eyes drawn to the section marked Petrified Woods. It looked harmless, just another shaded area. But I knew better. I knew what lurked there. I knew what it did. The Park Service would send more rangers, more search parties. They'd find Sarah's remains eventually, if the thing hadn't absorbed them completely. But they wouldn't understand. They wouldn't know the true horror. I'm still here in Ranger Station Gamma, pretending normalcy. I go on my patrols, I file my reports. But every night, I hear the whispers in the wind, a dry, sibilant hiss that reminds me of the ancient evil that stirs in the heart of Blackwood. And every morning I check my hands, terrified that the gray tinge will have deepened, that the cold will have crept further into my bones, until I, too, become another silent, stony sentinel in the petrified woods. The sun is setting again, and the forest is waiting. The incident in the petrified woods had left its mark, not just on my psyche, but on my very being. Every morning, I'd scrutinize my hand in the harsh light of the station, searching for that faint gray tinge, that subtle stiffness. The doctors, when I finally forced myself to see one outside the park, had found nothing. Stress, they'd said, exhaustion. They didn't understand the cold that still permeated my bones, the echoes of a dry, sibilant whisper that seemed to ride the wind, even miles from those stony sentinels. It had been a few weeks since then. Sarah's remains, or what was left of her after the petrification, had been recovered. The official report cited exposure, a bizarre geological anomaly causing the crystallization of tissue. A cover-up, a desperate attempt to rationalize the incomprehensible. I played along, nodding, pretending to accept their clinical assessment, but the truth gnawed at me like a feral beast. The forest, in its vast indifference, had seemed to settle back into a semblance of normalcy. The usual calls came in: lost hikers, illegal trapping, minor brush fires. But beneath the surface, a tremor of unease persisted. The animals were still skittish, some of the older, wiser ones migrating out of the forest altogether. And then the new phenomenon began, the disappearances around Lake Cyprian. Lake Cyprian was a deceptive beauty. Shimmering and serene on the surface, it was known for its treacherous currents, its sudden, deep drop-offs, and the dense, almost impenetrable reeds that choked its northern shores. Several small fishing boats, mostly belonging to local poachers or the few hardy souls who truly understood the lake, had gone missing. No distress calls, no wreckage, just an empty expanse where a boat should have been. And then, a few days ago, a park visitor, an amateur birdwatcher named Mrs. Henderson, vanished from the hiking trail that ran along the lake's eastern edge. The official search was underway, but I felt the familiar cold dread creeping in. This wasn't the petrified woods, but the pattern of unexplained disappearances, the unsettling silence that accompanied them, felt chillingly familiar. My supervisor, Ranger Davies, a man whose skepticism was as boundless as the forest itself, had assigned me to Lake Cyprian. "Thorne," he grunted, "you got a knack for finding trouble. Go see what's spooking these fishermen." Probably just drunk and capsized. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something unreadable. Perhaps even Davies, for all his bluster, was starting to feel the shift in the Blackwood. I drove my beat-up truck along the winding dirt track that led to the lake's southern boat launch. The sky was overcast, a low, oppressive gray that mirrored my mood. The air was heavy, damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and the faint, unsettling smell of stagnant water. As I approached the lake, the reeds became denser, a towering wall of brittle stalks that hissed and rustled in the non-existent wind. It was the whispering reeds, as the locals called them, a place where sounds seemed to distort, carrying odd echoes and making it impossible to pinpoint origins. I parked my truck, the silence of the area broken only by the distant squawk of a crow and the unsettling rustle of the reeds. The boat launch was empty, the air thick with a feeling of abandonment. I strapped on my heavy-duty waders, grabbed my long-handled grappling hook, and my sidearm, a Glock 22. No rifle this time. I needed to be agile. My plan was to navigate a small, inflatable raft into the reed beds, searching for any sign of Mrs. Henderson or the missing boats. It was a fool's errand, I knew. If the lake had taken them, they were gone. But I had to try. The moment the raft touched the water, an unnatural stillness descended. The crows stopped squawking. The reeds, which had been rustling moments before, became absolutely silent. It was as if the lake itself was holding its breath, watching me. I paddled slowly, pushing through the thick, muddy water. The reeds towered over me, creating narrow, twisting channels. Sunlight, what little there was, struggled to penetrate, casting the world into a gloomy, underwater-like green. The air grew heavy, damp, and the faint smell of stagnant water intensified, becoming cloying, sickly sweet, like decaying vegetation. As I went deeper, the channels became tighter, the reeds pressing in on all sides. The rustling sound started again, but it was different now. Not the wind, but a dry, scuttling noise, like something slithering just beneath the surface of the water, just out of sight, amidst the roots of the reeds. I stopped paddling, holding my breath, listening. The scuttling sound was everywhere now, 1,000 tiny movements around me, weaving through the dense network of reeds. It was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thump-thump, like a heartbeat, but too slow, too heavy to be my own. And then the whispers began. Not the dry hiss of the petrified woods, but a wet, gurgling murmur, like water bubbling through a narrow throat or someone speaking underwater. It was low, guttural, unintelligible, but intensely chilling. It seemed to come from directly beneath the raft, vibrating through the flimsy material, making my teeth ache. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off the dark water. I swung it wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. Nothing. Just the endless, swaying reeds. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding strained, swallowed by the oppressive silence and the gurgling whispers. "Is anyone there?" The gurgling intensified, surrounding me. And then a new sound. A faint, desperate splash, not a large one, but like something struggling just below the surface, close by. I gripped my grappling hook, my heart hammering. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that I was not alone here. Suddenly, a disturbance in the water. A small dark mass broke the surface just a few feet from the raft. It was a cluster of matted, dark hair, tangled with bits of reed. My breath caught in my throat. It was unmistakably human hair. I reached out with the grappling hook, my hand shaking, and snagged the hair. I pulled gently, my stomach churning, expecting the worst. What emerged from the murky water was not a head, but a hand. A human hand, pale and bloated, its fingers gnarled, covered in a slimy film of algae and mud. It looked like it had been down there for a very long time. As I pulled it closer, I saw a glint of metal on one of the fingers. A ring. A small, silver bird with outstretched wings. Mrs. Henderson was a keen bird watcher, known for her unique silver bird jewelry. The whispers around me grew louder, more frantic, accompanied by the persistent, rhythmic thump-thump. The water around the hand began to churn, small eddies forming, pulling at the reeds. It was as if something was stirring, waking up deep beneath the surface. And then, from just behind the floating hand, a face broke the surface. It was Mrs. Henderson, or what was left of her. Her skin was pallid, stretched taut over her bone structure, almost translucent. Her eyes were wide, milky white, staring blankly ahead. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but it wasn't the vacant stare of a drowned corpse. There was a horrifying alertness in those eyes, a silent plea that screamed louder than any voice. But it was what was in her mouth that made me gag. Her teeth, what few remained, were tiny, sharp, almost needle-like, like the teeth of a carnivorous fish. And clinging to her face, around her eyes and cheeks, were small, dark, glistening tendrils, like roots or tiny, black worms, burrowing into her flesh. The gurgling whispers intensified, emanating directly from her, from the water around her. Her head tilted slowly, impossibly, at an unnatural angle, and her milky eyes fixed on me. I saw not Mrs. Henderson, but something else looking out from behind those eyes, something ancient and hungry that had taken root within her. "Help me," a voice gurgled, not from her mouth, but seeming to vibrate in the water around her, echoing from the reeds themselves. It was the whispers, coalescing into a grotesque imitation of a human plea. "Help us." I recoiled violently, almost capsizing the raft. The reek of stagnant water and decay filled my nostrils. The hand I was holding with the grappling hook felt strangely heavy, resisting my attempt to pull it away. The tendrils on her face seemed to twitch, elongating, reaching towards me. I dropped the grappling hook, the metal clattering against the side of the raft. The moment I did, the water around Mrs. Henderson erupted. More bodies, or parts of bodies, surfaced around her, a limb, a torso, another head with the same sickeningly sharp teeth and burrowing tendrils. They were the missing fishermen, the vanished boaters, all of them bloated, pale, and horribly transformed, their eyes wide and milky, their mouths open in silent, gurgling pleas. They were all whispering the same thing, the sound rising to a chorus of wet, sickening murmurs. "Join us. Join the depths." The entire surface of the water around me began to roil. Dark, shadowy forms moved beneath the surface, stirring the mud and reeds. I saw glimpses of something large, serpentine, weaving through the submerged bodies. The rhythmic thump-thump was louder now, closer, directly beneath my raft. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. This wasn't a natural lake phenomenon. This was a living, breathing entity, something that preyed on the unwary, transforming them into its grotesque extensions. The petrified woods had turned flesh to stone. This thing turned living beings into instruments of its will, its terrible hunger. I scrambled for my paddle, ignoring the horrific sight of the reanimated dead surrounding me. They began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, their waterlogged limbs pushing through the reeds, reaching for the raft. Their sharp teeth glinted faintly in the gloom. I paddled with a desperate fury, splashing water in every direction. The raft scraped against the roots of the reeds, making slow progress. The reanimated corpses were surprisingly agile in the water, propelled by unseen forces. Their whispers became a chilling shriek, a cacophony of gurgling pleas and demands. One of them, a burly fisherman I recognized, lunged. His arm, slick with algae, shot out of the water, his gnarled fingers grasping at the edge of my raft. I saw the needle-like teeth in his open mouth, the black tendrils writhing on his face. I screamed a raw animal sound and brought my paddle down with all my might onto his outstretched hand. There was a sickening thud as the plastic connected with something that felt like bone, but also something soft and yielding. The fisherman's grip loosened, and he sank back beneath the surface, his milky eyes still locked on mine. I didn't wait. I paddled harder, my arms burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The chorus of whispers and gurgles followed me, the thump-thump of the unseen creature beneath the water echoing my own frantic heartbeat. I kept paddling, not looking back, not daring to. The channels of reeds seemed endless, twisting and turning, disorienting me. I could feel the cold, slimy tendrils of the water entity reaching for me, trying to pull me back, to pull me down into its depths. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the reeds thinned. The oppressive green gloom gave way to the gray, overcast light of the open lake. I burst out into the wider waters, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. I didn't stop until the raft scraped against the familiar concrete of the boat launch. I stumbled out, collapsing onto the damp earth, retching until my stomach was empty. My uniform was soaked, covered in mud and foul-smelling algae. My skin was clammy, chilled to the bone. I looked back at the lake, at the dense wall of whispering reeds. The surface of the water was calm, innocent. There were no reanimated corpses, no horrifying faces. But I knew what lay beneath. I managed to drag the raft back to my truck, my limbs heavy, my mind numb with shock. I drove back to the station in a haze, the image of Mrs. Henderson's face, those sharp teeth and writhing tendrils, burned into my retina. I filed a report, brief and deliberately vague. Unfavorable conditions in the reed beds. Possible currents. No sign of Mrs. Henderson or the missing boats. Advising caution for anyone venturing near the reeds. Davies just grunted, probably thinking I'd been spooked by a few fish. Let him think that. He wouldn't believe the truth anyway. Back in my small cabin, I stripped off my clothes, throwing them into a pile to be burned later. I stood under the hottest shower I could manage, scrubbing at my skin, trying to wash away the feeling of the lake's embrace, the phantom touch of those tendrils. But the coldness persisted, and the faint smell of stagnant water clung to me, no matter how much I scrubbed. I looked at my hands again. This time, there was no great tinge, no petrification, but they felt heavy, and a new sensation, a faint, almost imperceptible itching beneath the skin, as if something was trying to burrow its way in. The Blackwood National Forest was no longer just a place of wild beauty and natural dangers. It was a sentient entity, a patchwork quilt of ancient horrors, each with its own grotesque method of claiming victims. The petrified woods that turned flesh to stone, the lake of whispering reeds that transformed the dead into its grotesque servants. And I, Elias Thorne, was caught in the middle, a witness to unspeakable things. Sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. Every rustle of the wind outside sounded like whispering reeds. Every drip from the faucet sounded like gurgling water, and in the oppressive silence, I could almost hear the faint thump-thump of something ancient and hungry stirring in the depths of Lake Cyprian. I was beginning to understand why the old-timers called this place Blackwood. It wasn't just the color of the pines. It was the color of the dark, unfathomable things that festered beneath its surface. And I was becoming more and more a part of it. The psychic echo from Mount Cinder had settled into a dull throb behind my eyes, a constant reminder of the mountain's colossal, slumbering malice. The stiffness in my hands from the petrified woods was a phantom ache, and the phantom itch from Lake Cyprian occasionally resurfaced, a crawl beneath my skin that felt like something trying to push its way out. I was a patchwork quilt of Blackwood's horrors, each encounter weaving another thread of madness into my being. Ranger Davies had stopped assigning me to high-profile cases. Now it was mostly trail maintenance, perimeter checks, and paperwork. He'd look at me with pity, sometimes with a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes, but he never said anything. He knew I was broken. He just didn't want to know the cause. It suited me. The less attention, the better. I needed to understand what was happening to me, to this forest, before it completely consumed me. My research, or rather my desperate attempts to find answers, had become my obsession. I devoured old park archives, geological surveys, and local folklore. Most of it was mundane, predictable. But then I found a series of entries, faded and almost illegible, from a ranger who had served here in the early 20th century. His notes spoke of the whispering blight, the consuming verdancy, and most chillingly, the woods that remember. His final entry was a single, sprawling word, mimic. The location he described was vague, deep in a section of the forest rarely visited, marked on maps as simply dense canopy. It was an area known for unusually thick vegetation, even by Blackwood standards, and a complete lack of wildlife. No birdsong, no deer tracks, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. Locals called it the Tangled Grove and avoided it like the plague. I knew with the cold certainty that had become my constant companion that this was my next destination. Davies had assigned me to survey a rarely checked boundary marker nearby. It was the perfect excuse. The journey to the Tangled Grove was slow, arduous. The path, if it could even be called that, was overgrown, choked with thorny bushes and dense undergrowth. Sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy above, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of decaying leaves and something else, something cloyingly sweet, like overripe fruit, but with an underlying hint of something metallic and unpleasant. As I pushed deeper, the trees began to change. They were still pines and oaks, but their growth was distorted, unnatural. Branches intertwined in bizarre, impossible knots, forming dense, labyrinthine walls. The trunks were covered in thick, dark moss that seemed to writhe, and from their bark, strange, fleshy growths, like diseased fungi, sprouted in grotesque patterns. The deeper I went, the more the natural sounds of the forest faded. The rustle of my own movements, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, they became amplified, echoing unnervingly in the profound silence. There was no wind here, not even a breath. The air hung still and heavy, pressing down on me. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, like a secret shared by distant leaves. But it wasn't the dry hiss of the petrified woods, nor the gurgling murmur of Lake Cyprian. This whisper was human. Elias, it breathed soft and intimate from somewhere directly in front of me. My blood ran cold. I froze, my hand instinctively going to my sidearm. My name. How could anything out here know my name? Hello. I called out, my voice trembling, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Elias, the whisper came again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint, rustling sound, like silk brushing against silk. It was a woman's voice, soft and alluring, yet tinged with an unnerving undertone of sorrow. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight beam through the twisted trees. Nothing, just the grotesque boughs, stretching like arthritic fingers into the gloom. Who's there? I demanded, my voice gaining a desperate edge. Don't be afraid, the whisper cooed, now directly to my left, almost brushing my ear. It sounded like Sarah. Sarah, the hiker from the petrified woods, before she had been turned to stone. The voice was so real, so perfectly her, that a jolt of desperate hope, quickly followed by sickening dread, shot through me. "Sarah?" I whispered. My guard momentarily dropped. "Come closer," her voice urged, now from deeper within the grove ahead of me. "I'm lost. I need help." My heart pounded. Was it possible? Had she survived? No. I had seen her hand. I had felt the petrification myself. This was a trick. I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as the isolation playing tricks, or the lingering psychic residue from the mountain. But the voice was too perfect, too convincing. It preyed on my guilt, on my deep-seated regret that I hadn't been able to save her. I took a cautious step forward, then another. My rational mind screamed at me to turn back, but the raw, emotional part of me, the part that clung to the faintest glimmer of hope, urged me on. The whispering continued, weaving a narrative of distress and vulnerability, always just ahead, always just out of sight. It wasn't just Sarah's voice now. I heard Davy's, his voice stern, commanding me to turn back. Then my own voice, echoing my deepest fears and doubts, twisting them into tormenting questions. Then the voice of my long-dead mother, gentle and loving, calling me home. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a living cage around me. The air became heavier, cloying, like breathing thick syrup. The sweet, metallic scent grew overpowering, making my head swim. I felt a strange dizziness, a disorientation that made the world spin. I stumbled, my hand catching on a thick moss-covered tree trunk. The moss felt strangely soft, almost yielding, like flesh beneath the rough surface. As my fingers pressed into it, I felt a faint, rhythmic thump-thump, like a pulse. I yanked my hand back, horrified. The whispers intensified, no longer distinct voices, but a cacophony of sound, 1,000 voices speaking at once, indistinguishable, overwhelming. It was as if the very air was screaming with the collective memories of every lost soul in this place. And then the visions began. They flickered at the edges of my vision, not spectral forms like in the petrified woods, but hyper-realistic illusions. Mrs. Henderson, her face contorted in agony, struggling in the deep mud. The immense, stony hand of the mountain golem, reaching out to crush me. All my past traumas, made manifest, shimmering in the gloom, trying to drive me mad. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my ears, trying to block out the onslaught. But the whispers were inside my head, the visions behind my eyelids. The sweet, metallic smell filled my lungs, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I was breathing it in. It was poisoning me, distorting my mind. When I opened my eyes, the world had twisted. The trees were no longer just trees. Their branches seemed to stretch, contort, and merge, forming grotesque, skeletal faces in the bark. Their roots, thick and gnarled, coiled like serpents on the forest floor, seemingly grasping, pulling at my feet. The moss on the trunks pulsed, and I could see faint red veins beneath its surface. The trees were alive, and they were mimicking everything. They were mimicking my fears, my memories, my very sanity. A massive, gnarled root, thick as a python, snaked out from the ground and wrapped around my ankle. I cried out, stumbling. Another root snared my other leg. I fell, my rifle clattering away into the darkness. The whispers coalesced into a single, horrifying voice, now deep and resonant, emanating from the very ground beneath me, from the pulsating roots and the writhing moss. "You remember," it rumbled. "We remember. We consume. We become." The sweet, metallic scent was overwhelming now, and I felt a strange lethargy creeping over me. My limbs felt heavy, my mind clouded. The visions became more vivid, more terrifying. I saw myself a ranger, but my face was twisted, my eyes milky and dead, tendrils of moss growing from my skin. I was becoming one of them. The roots tightened their grip, pulling me slowly, inexorably, towards the base of a particularly massive ancient tree, its trunk impossibly wide, its bark like scarred flesh. I could see hollows within the pulsating moss, eye sockets, and a gaping maw. It wasn't just a tree. It was a massive ancient predator, rooted to the earth, feeding on minds, on memories, on life itself. I thrashed desperately, but my strength was failing. The numbness I had felt in the petrified woods, the lethargy from Lake Cyprian, it was all coming back intensified. My vision swam, tinged with green and sickly red, just as the maw-like hollows in the tree began to expand, revealing a cavernous, dark interior. A sharp, piercing shriek cut through the oppressive atmosphere. It was a natural sound, a hawk's cry loud and piercing, echoing through the unnatural silence. For a moment, the overwhelming presence of the mimicking tree wavered. The whispers faltered, the visions flickered. The roots around my ankles loosened, ever so slightly. It was enough. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward, ignoring the pain, ripping my legs free from the loosened roots. I clawed my way through the dense undergrowth, ignoring the thorns tearing at my skin, ignoring the whispers that now shrieked in anger, the visions that snapped and writhed around me. I ran blindly, stumbling, crashing through the tangled branches, driven by a primal need to escape. The sweet, metallic scent pursued me, but it began to thin, replaced by the cleaner, colder air of the outer forest. The illusions became less vivid, the whispers less distinct, until they were just faint echoes in my mind. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tangled grove, into a more familiar section of the forest, gasping for breath, collapsing onto the damp earth. My body was screaming, my mind shattered. I lay there for a long time, the hawk's cry a distant, comforting sound in the real world. My clothes were shredded, my skin lacerated. When I finally looked at my hands, there was no stony tinge, no burrowing marks. But they trembled uncontrollably, and my nails were chipped and bloody from my desperate struggle. The full weight of what I had just experienced settled over me. The trees that could mimic thought, that could consume sanity, that could reshape reality. The Blackwood was a living nightmare, and I was deep within its dream. Back at the station, I didn't even bother to clean myself up. I just sat at my desk, staring at the map. The petrified woods, Lake Cyprian, Mount Cinder, and now the tangled grove. They weren't isolated incidents. They were connected, a growing web of malevolence, each horror feeding into the next, each shaping me, changing me. My mind felt stretched thin, a drum skin taut over a hollow void. The silence of the station was no longer comforting. It was just a pause, a breath held before the next horror revealed itself. I knew with a terrible certainty that I wasn't just observing the Blackwood anymore. I was becoming part of it. And the worst part, I was beginning to wonder if a part of me, a small, dark, terrified part, was starting to accept it. The night was falling, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The escape from the tangled grove had been a narrow one. My mind, already frayed, felt like a tattered flag whipping in a gale. The constant drone of the mountain's psychic hum, the phantom stiffness of petrification, the ghostly itch from the lake's tendrils, and now, the insidious echoes of the mimicking woods, voices that whispered my deepest fears and memories. They were a relentless chorus in my skull. I was Elias Thorne, ranger, but also, increasingly, a walking testament to Blackwood's grim power. Davies had called, his voice tight with concern. "Thorne, are you all right? You've been distant, and your reports are getting thin." I mumbled something about a stomach bug, about the trails being quiet. He didn't press. He just told me to take a few days off, clear my head. He thought I was breaking. He was right, but not in the way he understood. My time off became another desperate foray into the park archives. The old ranger's journal from the early 20th century was my only guide, its faded ink and cryptic entries my only hope. I searched for anything that might hint at a pattern, a connection between the horrors I'd encountered. And there, buried beneath a section on forgotten logging trails, I found it. A sketch crudely drawn of what looked like dilapidated cabins, partially submerged in water, and a single chilling word, silence. The sketch was labeled simply North Mire. It was an area on the map marked as an expansive, impenetrable swamp bordering the northwestern edge of the park. It was officially off-limits due to treacherous terrain and dangerous wildlife. No hiking trails, no regular patrols. A perfect place for things to be forgotten, to fester. The previous ranger's notes mentioned a place where sound goes to die, and the great silence. This was it, the next mouth of Blackwood. I prepared for this expedition differently. No optimistic notions of rescue. No naive hopes of scientific explanation. This was a reconnaissance mission into enemy territory. I packed light, prioritizing survival gear, powerful headlamp, a military-grade compass, waterproof matches, rations, and, of course, my rifle loaded and ready. This time, I knew a bullet might not stop what I faced, but it was a comfort to hold something tangible, something that offered even the illusion of control. The approach to North Mire was unlike any other part of Blackwood. The towering pines gave way to cypress trees, their gnarled knees rising from the murky water. The ground softened, becoming a spongy, sucking bog that threatened to swallow my boots with every step. The air grew thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water, a smell far more potent than what I'd encountered at Lake Cyprian. And then the gnats. Swarms of them, biting, relentless, a living cloud that buzzed around my head. But worse than the gnats, worse than the stench, was the silence. It began subtly, the chirping of crickets fading, the distant cries of waterfowl receding. As I pushed deeper into the mire, the sounds diminished, not gradually, but as if they were being actively absorbed. The buzzing of the gnats around my head became muted, muffled. The squelch of my boots in the mud, the rustle of my clothes, they barely made a sound. It was as if the very air refused to carry vibrations. The trees here were ancient, their bark peeling like diseased skin, draped with long gray strands of Spanish moss that hung like shrouds. The water, dark and still, reflected the oppressive gray sky, creating a mirror image of desolation. It was cold here, a bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground, cold that spoke of utter stillness and death. I reached a point where the trees thinned out, opening into a vast expanse of dark, open water, dotted with skeletal cypress trees. And there, emerging from the murky depths, were the structures from the old ranger's sketch. Dilapidated cabins, their roofs caved in, their wooden walls rotted and slime-covered, half submerged in the bog. A sunken settlement, swallowed by the mire. I navigated carefully, wading through the chest-deep water, the mud sucking at my waders. The silence here was absolute terrifying. It pressed in on my eardrums, creating a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice was swallowed, dying in my throat, a mere breath escaping my lips. It was a silence so profound, it felt physical, like a suffocating blanket. As I approached the first cabin, the air grew colder still, and the smell of decay became sharper, cloying. I could make out details now. A rusty kettle on a warped wooden table, a child's toy half submerged, a fishing net tangled with dark, slimy weeds. A life had existed here, long ago, swallowed by the mire and this terrible quiet. I stepped onto the porch of the largest cabin, the rottenwood groaning faintly under my weight. Even that small sound felt deafening in the silence, a blasphemy against the oppressive stillness. My headlamp cut through the gloom inside, revealing a scene of utter dereliction. Everything was covered in a thick layer of gray mold and black slime. And then I saw the figures. They sat on a rotting bench at a table in various states of decay, covered in the same gray mold and black slime as the cabin itself. They were human forms, or what used to be human. Their skin was shriveled, leathery, clinging to bone. Their clothes were rotted rags. Their faces were hollow, eye sockets empty, mouths agape. They looked like mummified corpses, preserved by the bog, but also as something more. There was no smell of death, no putrefaction, just that cloying, heavy scent of decay. And the silence. The absolute, soul-crushing silence that clung to them, that permeated the very air of the cabin. I raised my headlamp, sweeping it across the room. There were dozens of them, frozen in their final moments, not just in this cabin, but visible in the other submerged structures. They were the inhabitants of this forgotten settlement, claimed by the mire and by this silence. As my light passed over one of the figures, something shifted. A faint tremor, almost imperceptible. I focused my beam back on it. It was a woman, slumped over a wooden barrel, her bony hand still clutching what looked like a needle and thread. Her head slowly, agonizingly turned. There was no sound. No creak of bone, no rustle of fabric. Just the slow, silent rotation of her head, until her empty eye sockets were fixed on me. I felt a cold dread, worse than anything I had experienced before. This wasn't petrification, or reanimation, or psychic assault. This was something that consumed sound, consumed life, leaving behind only silent, preserved husks. And she was aware. The other figures in the room began to stir, imperceptibly at first. A twitch of a finger, a slight tilt of a head, all in absolute silence. Their movements were agonizingly slow, like statues struggling against unseen bonds. But they were moving, and they were all turning to face me. The silence intensified, pressing in on my skull, making my ears ache, my head pound. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active force, a vacuum that pulled at the very vibrations of life. I felt my own voice trying to form a scream, but it died in my throat, choked by the oppressive void. My heartbeat, which should have been thundering, was barely a muffled throb in my chest. My breath was thin, shallow, barely audible. The figures began to rise, slowly, silently, their limbs creaking without a sound, their rotted joints grinding against each other in an unnerving pantomime of movement. They shuffled towards me, their empty eye sockets fixed, their mouths agape in silent, terrifying screams. Their very presence drained the sound from the air, from my own body. I tried to raise my rifle, but my arms felt heavy, leaden. The silence was seeping into me, slowing my movements, dulling my senses. I could feel my own heartbeat faltering, becoming fainter, more distant. My voice was gone, trapped in the vacuum. One of the mummified figures reached me, a man with a tattered lumberjack shirt. His hand, skeletal and covered in mold, stretched towards me. I saw his mouth open wider, as if trying to suck the very air from my lungs, the very life from my being. The silence around his hand was absolute, a chilling void. With a desperate surge of will, I forced my hand to move, striking out with the rifle, but it connected with his chest with a soft, sickening thud that barely registered, a soundless impact in the suffocating void. The figure staggered back, its silent scream still echoing in my mind, even if I couldn't hear it. I stumbled off the porch, splashing into the murky water. The other figures were closing in, surrounding the cabin, their movements slow but relentless, their silent, gaping mouths fixed on me. They were the silent ones, the swallowed, the forgotten, and they wanted me to join their eternal quiet. I forced myself to move, wading through the viscous water, away from the cabin, away from the terrifying, soundless hunters. The silence followed, a tangible force pressing against my back, trying to draw me back into its maw. My limbs felt heavy, the water a thick, resisting force. My own breathing was barely a whisper, my heart barely a thrum. I plunged into the thicker reeds, desperate to escape. The silence here was less absolute, the distant buzz of gnats a faint, almost ethereal sound. I could feel the invisible barrier of the sound-draining field, pushing against me, trying to pull me back into its horrifying grasp. I didn't stop until I had pushed through the deepest parts of the mire, until the faint sound of the natural world, a distant bird call, the rustle of leaves, began to return, agonizingly slowly, as if returning from a great distance. I collapsed on solid ground, gasping, trying to draw a full, resonant breath. The ringing in my ears slowly subsided, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. I was out, but I was not whole. Back at the station, I peeled off my mud-caked clothes, discarding them in a heap. My skin was pale, clammy. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, but beyond that, I looked drawn, as if something vital had been subtly drained from me. My voice, when I tried to speak, was hoarse, whisper-thin, like I hadn't used it in a decade. The silent ones, they didn't kill with violence or transformation. They killed with absence, by taking everything that made you alive, leaving behind a conscious, silent husk. And a part of me, a deep, primal part, still felt the pull of that terrible quiet, a strange, morbid curiosity. The Blackwood National Forest, a place of petrified bodies, reanimated drowned, waking mountains and mind-mimicking trees. And now a sunken settlement where silence itself was a predator. I looked at the map again. The petrified woods, Lake Cyprian, Mount Cinder, the Tangled Grove, and North Mire. 5 points, each a different facet of the same terrible, pervasive evil. And at the absolute center, the largest, most unblighted section of the map, marked simply Deep Forest. an area I had always avoided, thinking it too unremarkable, too safe. Now I knew better. The worst horrors were often hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by normalcy, waiting to be discovered. I had a terrible premonition that the Blackwood was not done with me, and I was beginning to suspect that I was not done with the Blackwood. The night was falling, and the silence outside Ranger Station Gamma felt heavier than usual, almost expected. The silence of the North Mire had left me with a permanent ringing in my ears, a high-pitched drone that muffled the normal world. My voice, after its silent assault, was still thin and reedy. The previous horrors of Blackwood were no longer distinct memories but a part of my very fabric. The phantom stiffness from the petrified woods, the unsettling itch from Lake Cyprian's tendrils, the psychic hum from Mount Cinder, and the insidious whispers of the mimicking woods. I was a mosaic of Blackwood's grim power, a walking, breathing testament to its malevolence. Davies had stopped calling. I hadn't reported in for days. My food supply was dwindling, my cabin a mess of maps, old journals, and discarded gear. I was a recluse, driven by a singular, terrifying purpose: to find the source, to find the center of it all. My research, or rather my desperate dive into the obscure history of the park, had reached a fever pitch. The old ranger's journal, now practically falling apart in my hands, had one last, heavily underlined entry, almost a warning: the seed. In the deep forest. It waits. It feeds. This was followed by a series of fragmented sentences about the great sleep, the waking, and the consumption of all. The last words were a scrawled, desperate plea. Burn it. Burn it all. Deep forest. The largest, most uncharted, and deceptively unremarkable section on the map. No trails, no landmarks. Just dense green. I knew this was where it all began, where the core of Blackwood's evil resided. The very thought filled me with an unspeakable dread, but also a grim, desperate resolve. I had seen too much, been changed too much, to turn back now. I packed my last rations, my most powerful flashlight, a fresh clip for my rifle, and a single heavy jerry can of gasoline. The old ranger's last words echoed in my mind. Burn it. It was a desperate, probably futile plan, but it was a plan nonetheless. The journey into the deep forest was unlike any other. There was no distinct boundary, no change in tree type or terrain. It was a gradual thickening, an insidious deepening. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, their branches so intertwined that the sky became a mere memory, a thin sliver of gray far above. The air was unnaturally still, humid, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something incredibly ancient, like ozone and dried blood, but also a faint, sickly sweet aroma, like decaying flowers. The ground was soft, a thick carpet of centuries of fallen leaves and moss, muffling my footsteps completely. The silence here was different from North Mire's vacuum. It was a profound, watchful silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, listening to my every move. No birds, no rustle of small animals, no insects. Just the occasional faint drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the immense canopy. As I pushed deeper, the trees began to take on an even more unsettling character. Their bark was not rough, but smooth and slick, like stretched skin. Their branches, thick and rope-like, seemed to pulse faintly with an internal light, a deep, unsettling green glow that emanated from within the wood itself. The leaves were impossibly dark, almost black, absorbing all light, casting the forest floor into a perpetual, suffocating gloom. And then the sound began. Not a whisper, not a gurgle, not a groan, but a low, rhythmic thrum. It was deep, resonant, vibrating through the very ground beneath my feet, through the air, through my bones. It was the sound of a colossal heartbeat, slow and ancient, emanating from the very core of the deep forest. The thrum grew louder with every step, and with it a new sensation, a subtle, irresistible pull, a magnetic force drawing me deeper, directly towards the source of the sound. My compass needle spun wildly useless. My sense of direction warped, twisted by the forest's strange influence. All I could do was follow the thrum, follow the pull. Then I saw them. Not figures, not illusions, but structures. Organic, yet architectural. Massive, gnarled roots, thick as concrete pillars, intertwined and woven together to form archways and grotesque, spiraling tunnels. These weren't just trees. They were living, breathing conduits, parts of a vast, unseen organism. The green internal glow within the wood intensified, casting long, shifting shadows that danced and writhed, mimicking unseen movements. The air here was thick with a strange, sickly, sweet scent. It was becoming harder to breathe, as if the oxygen was being slowly consumed. I stumbled into a clearing, if it could be called that. It wasn't open to the sky, but rather to an immense, vaulted ceiling of intertwining branches, pulsing with that same eerie green light. At the center of this natural cathedral, bathed in the sickly green glow, was the seed. It wasn't what I expected. Not a giant plant or a rock. It was a massive, pulsating orb roughly 30 feet in diameter, composed of tightly woven roots, bark, and what looked like solidified dark green sap. It rested on a pedestal of similarly woven earth and root, slowly, rhythmically expanding and contracting, breathing with a deep thrum that filled the entire clearing. Its surface was covered in a network of faint, vein-like patterns that pulsed with light. And within those veins, I could make out shapes, indistinct and horrifying. Faces. Tiny, distorted faces, constantly shifting, melting, and reforming within the green light. They were human, animal, monstrous, a grotesque kaleidoscope of all life, past and present, consumed by the seed. The very air around the seed shimmered with an unbearable pressure, a silent scream of 1,000 absorbed souls. I felt the collective despair, the pain, the terror of everything Blackwood had claimed. It wasn't just consuming life. It was consuming essence, drawing it into itself, adding it to its grotesque tapestry of being. And then the seed responded to my presence. The thrum intensified, vibrating through my entire body, making my bones ache. The internal green light flared, casting the clearing in a blinding emerald pulse. The faces within the veins writhed, their silent mouths agape in a horrifying chorus of terror and something else, something that felt like a primal, ancient recognition. The roots that formed the pedestal around the seed began to move. Slowly, like immense, awakening serpents, they uncoiled, stretching outwards, reaching towards me. More roots, thick as anaconda, emerged from the surrounding earth, slithering towards me, their tips probing the ground like blind feelers. I raised my rifle, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The gasoline can felt impossibly heavy. Burn it. I aimed at the pulsating orb, my finger hovering over the trigger. But then the faces within the seed shifted, and one solidified unmistakably. Sarah. Her eyes, not milky white like in the lake, but full of agony, her silent scream trapped within the green sap. Then Mrs. Henderson, her mouth open, the tiny, sharp teeth visible. Then glimpses of the silent ones, their mummified faces contorted in terror. My own mother, her face pleading. Even Davies, his features contorted in a silent, horrified grimace. The mimicking woods had shown me my fears. The seed showed me my failures. The roots were almost upon me, their tips weaving closer, trying to ensnare my legs. I could feel the cold emanating from them, the same ancient chill I'd felt in the petrified woods, the same damp, cloying cold from the lake of whispering reeds. This was where it all began, where all the horrors converged. The seed was the heart, the brain, the stomach of Blackwood. I wouldn't be petrified, or reanimated, or silenced. I would be absorbed. My essence, my memories, my very being, will be added to that horrific tapestry of faces, eternally trapped within the pulsating green sap. No, I whispered, my voice raw, broken. With a desperate, primal yell, I lifted the jerry can. It was my only chance. The roots were closing in, already brushing against my boots. I swung the can with all my remaining strength, smashing it against the pulsating surface of the seed. The impact was sickeningly soft, like hitting thick, yielding flesh. The can ruptured, spilling gasoline across the surface of the orb, its pungent smell briefly overpowering the sickly sweetness. The green light within the seed flickered wildly, and the thrum faltered, becoming a tortured, rattling gasp. The faces within writhed in agony. The roots recoiled, a collective hiss of something like pain emanating from the ground. It was my moment. I fumbled for my waterproof matches, my fingers numb. The silence of the clearing was broken only by the seed's gasping thrum and my own ragged breathing. I struck a match. It flared to life, a tiny beacon in the oppressive gloom. I tossed it. The gasoline-soaked surface of the seed ignited with an explosive whoosh. Fire erupted, a furious, cleansing orange against the eerie green. The sickly sweet smell of the sap mixed with the acrid stench of burning fuel, and something else, something metallic and indescribably ancient, like burning bone. The seed screamed. Not a sound heard with ears, but a psychic shriek that tore through my mind, 1,000 voices of agony, 1,000,000 years of malice released in one shattering moment. The entire clearing was bathed in the blinding, searing light of the inferno. The intertwining branches above me caught fire, their ancient, slick bark curling and blackening. The ground shook violently as the roots thrashed, trying to escape the flames, trying to put out the fire. But the gasoline had seeped deep into the porous, organic matter of the seed, and the flames consumed it with terrifying speed. I scrambled back, shielding my face from the intense heat, the blinding light. The mental screams slowly, agonizingly, faded, replaced by the roar and crackle of the fire. The faces within the seed's surface contorted, then dissolved, consumed by the flames, their torment finally at an end. I stood there watching as the heart of Blackwood burned. The ancient, consuming horror that had plagued this forest for untold millennia, that had stolen so many, that had transformed me, was finally dying. The inferno raged for what felt like hours. The air filled with smoke and ash. Slowly, agonizingly, the pulsating thrum faded, until it was replaced by the dying crackle of embers and the distant, familiar sounds of the living forest, a whisper of wind, a far-off bird call. When the flames finally died down, what was left was a smoldering, blackened crater. The once vibrant green roots were now brittle, charred remnants. The pervasive sense of ancient malice had lifted, replaced by a profound, if fragile, sense of peace. I stumbled out of the deep forest, covered in soot and ash, my face streaked with tears and sweat. My body ached, my mind was exhausted, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt lighter. The constant psychic hum had vanished. The phantom stiffness and itch were gone. My voice, though still hoarse, felt like my own again. I made it back to Ranger Station Gamma as the sun rose, painting the sky in a triumphant burst of gold and red. The air outside felt clean, fresh, devoid of the sickly, sweet scent of the seed. I collapsed into my bed, sleeping deeper and more peacefully than I had in months, my dreams mercifully blank. When I awoke, I looked at my hands. They were scratched, bruised, but whole. No great tinge, no phantom itching. I spoke, and my voice, though still a little rough, was clear. The Blackwood National Forest was still Blackwood. It was still a wild, dangerous place. But the ancient, insidious evil that had festered at its heart, that had consumed and corrupted all around it, was gone. I don't know if anyone will ever believe my story. Davies will probably assume I finally had a breakdown and set a brush fire. But I know what I did. I saved Blackwood. And in doing so, I saved myself. I'm still Ranger Thorn. I still patrol these woods. But now when the wind whispers, it's just the wind. And when the silence falls, it's just the quiet of the forest, not the dreadful hush of something ancient and hungry waiting in the dark. The Blackwood still has its secrets, its dangers. But the greatest horror, the one that fed on life and sanity, has been purged. And I, Elias Thorne, am a survivor. I carry the scars, the memories, but I also carry the knowledge that even in the deepest, darkest parts of the world, there is still hope for a new dawn. My name is Lena Harding, and for the past 2 years, I've been a park ranger in the sprawling ancient expanse of the Redwood National Park. Most people think of Redwood as a place of serene majesty, of towering titans that touch the sky, a cathedral of nature. They see the postcard views, the sun-dappled trails, the sheer, breathtaking scale. They don't see the shadows. They don't hear the whispers that slither between the colossal trunks when the last light of day dies. I'd always consider myself pragmatic, grounded. My work was about conservation, about protecting the wilderness and its visitors. I dealt with lost hikers, illegal logging, the occasional bear incident. Mundane, solvable problems. But lately, the problems in my sector, The northernmost reaches bordering the fog-shrouded coast had stopped being mundane. They'd started being impossible. It began with the birds. Songbirds, typically vibrant and numerous, grew silent. Their nests were found abandoned, their feathers scattered on the forest floor, untouched by scavengers. Then the elk. Herds known for their predictable grazing patterns vanished, leaving no tracks, no sign of migration, just an unsettling emptiness in their usual clearings. The forest, once alive with the symphony of its inhabitants, was becoming unnervingly quiet, the silence broken only by the mournful wail of the wind off the Pacific. My supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Miller, dismissed it as seasonal shifts, unusual animal behavior. He had seen it all, or so he claimed. But his eyes, when he thought I wasn't looking, held a flicker of unease. He lived here longer than any of us, and even he couldn't fully rationalize the creeping desolation. The official reports started pouring in a week ago. Missing persons. Not just inexperienced tourists wandering off trail, but seasoned local hunters, trackers who knew these woods like the back of their hands. They vanished without a trace, their hunting camps abandoned, fires still smoldering, gear neatly packed. It was as if they simply ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the ancient trees. And then the sound. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I noticed it on my solitary patrols, a faint tremor that would fade if I tried to focus on it. I dismissed it as geological activity, distant vibrations from the Earth's crust. But it grew. Today, the hum was a constant companion, a deep, pervasive thrumming that resonated in my chest, in my teeth, in the very marrow of my bones. It was evening, and the characteristic coastal fog was rolling in, thick and cold, obscuring the colossal redwoods in a milky shroud. My patrol route was taking me deep into an old-growth section known as the Hollows, an area characterized by ancient, immense redwoods, some of them so vast their interiors had hollowed out over centuries, forming cavernous, fire-scarred chambers. They were majestic, natural wonders, but today they felt like gaping mouths. The fog was swallowing the last vestiges of daylight, turning the forest into a monochrome world of gray and deeper gray. The air was heavy with moisture, carrying the damp scent of redwood bark and decaying leaves. The hum, now almost deafening, vibrated through the mist, making the very air feel alive with an unseen presence. I pushed through a curtain of ferns, my flashlight beam cutting a path through the swirling fog. The giant redwoods loomed around me, their immense trunks disappearing into the mist-shrouded canopy. They felt less like trees and more like silent, ancient sentinels, watching, waiting. The lack of any animal sounds was profound, unsettling. Not even the rustle of a squirrel, the chirping of a hidden bird. Just the oppressive hum and the drip of condensation from the needles above. I approached one of the largest hollow redwoods, a gnarled behemoth known as Whisper's Mouth. Its base was a gaping maw, a burnt-out cavern large enough to drive a truck through. Tourists loved it. I found it deeply unsettling, even before the disappearances. Tonight, it seemed to pulse with a hum, a dark, resonant echo chamber. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand on the holstered sidearm. My training told me to be cautious, to call for backup. But Miller was miles away, likely scoffing at my overactive imagination, and a stronger, more primal urge, a terrifying curiosity, was pulling me in. I needed to understand. I stepped inside Whisper's Mouth. The air within was colder, stiller, and carried a faint, sweet, metallic smell, like old blood and something vaguely floral, like lilies. The hum intensified, vibrating directly through the ancient, fire-scarred wood around me. My flashlight beam pierced the gloom, revealing the cavernous interior, blackened by ancient fires, reaching up into impenetrable darkness. The walls of the hollow were incredibly smooth in places, almost polished, despite the charred texture. And there, etched into the dark wood, I saw them. Marks. Not natural patterns, not random scratches. These were glyphs. Intricate, swirling symbols, repeating in a dizzying pattern, stretching up into the darkness. They weren't carved. They looked like they had grown there, part of the very wood itself. They pulsed faintly with the hum. As I stared at the glyphs, low, sibilant whisper filled the hollow. It wasn't a human voice, nor the sound of wind. It was a dry, rustling sound, like 1,000 brittle leaves skittering across a stone floor, or the friction of a million tiny insects. It seemed to come from all around me, emanating from the very wood of the hollow. "Welcome," the whisper hissed, impossibly. My breath hitched. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a trick of the acoustics. This was a sentient sound. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice thin and reedy, swallowed by the hollow's oppressive embrace. The whisper intensified, growing in volume, surrounding me, pressing in on my eardrums. It wasn't coherent words, just a chaotic symphony of dry, rustling hisses and clicks. But I felt its intent, cold and ancient, burrowing into my mind. It was a probing, curious awareness assessing me. Suddenly, the hum changed. It deepened, becoming a heavy, resonant thump-thump, like a colossal heartbeat. The entire redwood around me seemed to shift, a faint, organic groan emanating from its immense bulk. The glyphs on the walls pulsed brighter, their intricate patterns seeming to writhe and flow. And then, from the darkest recesses of the hollow, high above, something began to descend. It was slow, ponderous, a shadowy mass against the barely perceptible light from the entrance. As it came closer, I saw that it was not a single entity, but a conglomeration. It was made of wood, of bark, of countless strands of fibrous material, woven together into a vaguely humanoid shape, elongated and impossibly thin. Its limbs were like gnarled branches, its body a dense tangle of roots and interwoven bark. It had no discernible face, but where eyes should be, two pools of deeper darkness seemed to absorb the light, drawing my gaze. It was a creature born of the redwood, a living manifestation of the ancient tree itself. The rustling whisper intensified, now emanating directly from the creature, its every movement accompanied by the dry hiss of 1,000 shifting fibers. It was the whisper. It landed silently on the hollow's floor, its massive form radiating an aura of ancient, cold power. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide, its root-like feet making no sound on the charred earth. It moved with an eerie, graceful precision, its elongated arms slowly reaching out. I stumbled back, my mind screaming in primal terror. This was not a bear. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was a horror I couldn't comprehend, a living tree monster that moved and thought. "You smell of them," the whisper hissed, coherent now, the dry rustling forming words that scraped against my sanity. "The lost ones. Their essence clings to you." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just physical. It was consuming something deeper. The creature's elongated fingers, tipped with sharp, bark-like claws, reached out further, its movements accelerating. I could feel a cold, intangible force pulling at me, trying to draw me towards its shadowy form. It was a drain, an insidious siphoning of energy. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, as if my very life force was being tugged away. I fumbled for my sidearm, drawing it with trembling hands. My training, my instincts, were screaming at me to run, but the creature's presence was like an anchor, rooting me to the spot. "Join them," the whisper urged, its voice resonating in my skull, bypassing my ears. "Become one with the silent woods." I fired. The shot echoed deafeningly in the hollow, a sharp, violent crack against the oppressive hum. The creature didn't flinch. The bullet merely embedded itself in its fibrous body, a tiny pockmark on its immense form. No blood, no scream of pain, just the continued, relentless movement forward. It wasn't just made of wood. It was the essence of wood, of bark, of the very life of the forest, condensed into a terrifying form. I fired again, and again, emptying the clip. The bullets had no effect, merely chipping away at its seemingly impervious form. It was like shooting at a living mountain. The creature was close now, its long, gnarled fingers just inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the draining sensation becoming overwhelming. My vision blurred, my knees buckled. I was losing strength, my life force being drawn out of me, flowing towards the ancient horror. Then, from the depths of its shadowy form, I saw something. Not eyes, but faint, shimmering points of light, like trapped embers, deep within its body. And within those lights, fleeting glimpses of human faces, distorted by terror and agony. the missing hunters, the vanished bird watchers. They were all there, absorbed, their essences trapped within the creature, powering its terrible existence. It was feeding, and I was next. Its elongated fingers brushed against my face. The touch was impossibly cold, like death itself. I felt a sharp, piercing pain, not physical, but mental violation, as if something was reaching into my mind, probing my memories, my experiences. It was searching, consuming. I screamed, a silent, internal scream that tore at the edges of my sanity. I fell backward, scrambling away from the horrifying touch, desperate to escape the draining grip. My hand landed on something on the charred ground. My hunting knife. I hadn't even remembered packing it. With a surge of pure animalistic desperation, I lunged forward, not at the creature's body, but at the ground. I plunged the blade into the charred earth, digging frantically, my fingers scraping against something hard. The creature paused, its hum deepening to an angry snarl, the whisper a furious, chaotic rush of sound. It seemed confused by my actions, by my refusal to engage it directly. What I found was not a root, not a rock, a small obsidian shard sharp as a razor. It looked ancient, unnatural, unlike any stone found in the redwoods. It shimmered faintly with an internal light, a cold, almost crystalline glow. A desperate, insane thought flashed through my mind, a memory from a forgotten folklore class in ranger training. The old tales of bloodstones and heart roots hidden deep within ancient forests, objects of immense power, both generative and destructive. The seed, the old ranger's journal had called it. Was this the redwood's equivalent? The thing at the center of the monster? Ignoring the tree creature, which was now lumbering towards me with renewed fury, I grabbed the obsidian shard. The moment my fingers closed around it, a searing cold ripped through my hand, followed by a shock of pure, untamed energy. It felt like holding a piece of frozen lightning. The creature screamed, a psychic shriek that blasted through my mind, sharper and more intense than anything I had felt before. It reacted with blinding speed, its massive, gnarled arm lashing out, aiming to crush me. But I was faster. Or perhaps the shard itself imbued me with a desperate, momentary strength. I brought the obsidian shard up, not aiming for its body, but at the swirling, indistinct darkness where its face should have been, at the focal point of those trapped, shimmering essences. I thrust the shard forward, plunging it deep into the creature's form. There was no sound of impact, just a sickening, tearing sensation, like severing muscle from bone, even though it was wood. The creature froze. The hum, the whisper, the internal thrumming, it all stopped. The green light within its body pulsed wildly, then dimmed. The shimmering faces within its form flared, then vanished, released from their horrific prison. The creature stood motionless for a terrifying moment, the obsidian shard buried deep within its form. Then slowly, almost gracefully, it began to unravel. Its limbs, its body, its very structure began to fray, to disintegrate, not into dust, but into countless strands of fibrous material, like a vast ancient tapestry coming undone. The silence in the hollow was no longer oppressive, but a vast, empty void. The sweet, metallic smell faded. The cold began to recede. The creature collapsed in on itself, a silent, ponderous heap of bark and wood fibers, dissolving into a pile of dark, decaying matter. The obsidian shard, still glowing faintly, lay embedded in the center of the now inert mass. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold energy of the shard still tingling in my hand. I had done it. I had killed it. Or at least, I had stopped it. The silence that remained was profound, but it felt different now. No longer predatory, but peaceful. The weight lifted from my shoulders, from my mind. The echoes of the past horrors faded, becoming faint, distant memories. I stumbled out of Whisper's mouth, into the pre-dawn mist. The redwoods still loomed, majestic and ancient, but the oppressive aura was gone. I felt a deep weariness, but also a profound, bone-deep relief. I made my way back to my small ranger station, my movements slow, my body aching. My uniform was torn, covered in mud and bark fragments. I looked like I'd been through a war. Which, in a way, I had. I knew Miller wouldn't believe me. He'd chalk it up to a vivid dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. I wouldn't tell him about the tree monster, about the obsidian shard. Some secrets were best kept to the wilderness itself. I carefully cleaned the obsidian shard, wrapping it in a piece of canvas, and stored it in a locked box beneath my cabin floor. A trophy, a reminder, and perhaps a warning. The sun was rising as I finally collapsed onto my cot. Its first rays pierced through the clearing fog, painting the ancient redwoods in a soft, golden light. The forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could too. I was still Lena Harding, a park ranger. But I was also a survivor, a protector of a different kind now. I knew the true depths of the Redwood National Park's ancient power, its capacity for both breathtaking beauty and unspeakable horror. And I knew that even in the deepest, darkest hollows, there was still a chance to fight back, to silence the whispers, and to bring a fragile peace to the ancient woods. The obsidian shard rested in its locked box beneath my cabin, a cold, silent testament to the horrors of Whisper's mouth. The hum that once vibrated through my bones was gone, replaced by the mundane sounds of the forest. The constant internal whispers were no longer a torment but a fading echo. I had faced the Whisperer, the living heart of the Redwood's ancient malevolence, and I had, against all odds, survived. But survival in the Redwood National Park felt less like a victory and more like a reprieve. The immense trees still loomed, ancient and indifferent, and while one horror was gone, the forest was vast, its depths unexplored. Miller, my supervisor, had given me a stern lecture about unauthorized excursions and the importance of following protocol. He saw a tired ranger. He didn't see a woman haunted by the knowledge of what truly lurked in the ancient groves. A new problem had begun to surface, insidious and disturbing. Hikers, primarily those exploring the less-traveled trails in the western canyons, were reporting strange phenomena. Disorienting echoes, voices that weren't there, and an overwhelming sense of being watched, even in broad daylight. One couple swore they saw themselves, their own doppelgangers, walking ahead of them on the trail. Miller attributed it to forest fatigue and overactive imaginations. I knew better. The redwood had another mouth. My assigned patrol this week took me into the very heart of these reports, Echo Canyon. It was a narrow, winding fissure in the earth, carved by ancient rivers, now mostly dry save for a trickle in the deeper sections. The canyon walls were steep, shadowed, and known for their unusual acoustics, often carrying voices and sounds for miles. Today, that characteristic felt less like a geological marvel and more like a deliberate trap. The air in the canyon was cool, damp, and held a faint, almost imperceptible scent of dust and something metallic like stale pennies. The fog, a constant companion in this region, clung to the canyon rim, diffusing the sunlight into a weak, ethereal glow. The immense redwoods above were hidden by the mist, their unseen presence a heavy weight. As I descended into the canyon, the immediate silence of the outer forest gave way to a strange, disorienting cacophony. The acoustics were indeed amplified, but it wasn't just my footsteps echoing. I heard whispers, distant and unintelligible, seeming to emanate from the very stone walls. They weren't the dry hiss of the whisperer, but hollow, breathy sounds, like secrets being told by the air itself. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud, then repeating back to me, distorted, from multiple directions. "Hello, hello, low." The echoes twisted my words, making them alien. The deeper I went, the more intense the sensation became. The whispers grew in number, weaving into a complex tapestry of sound. I heard what sounded like children laughing, a woman weeping, a man's angry shout, all faint, all distorted, all without any discernible source. They weren't just echoes. They felt like fragments of past events, trapped in the very rock. My head began to ache, a dull throb behind my eyes. The sounds weren't just auditory. They were becoming tactile, a vibration on my skin, a pressure in my skull. It felt like the canyon was trying to speak, to communicate its myriad memories, but without cohesion, without understanding. I reached a wider section of the canyon, where walls rose perhaps 100 feet on either side, slick with moss and dark with perpetual shadow. And there, amidst the loose shale and stunted ferns, I saw them. Not people, but impressions. Faint, shimmering outlines in the air, like heat haze or distortions in a reflection. They were humanoid, vague, and translucent, flickering just at the edge of my vision. As I tried to focus, they would shift, performing slightly. Sometimes they looked like hikers, sometimes like historical figures in old mining gear, sometimes like indistinct, amorphous blobs. They weren't the trapped essences of the Whisperer, nor the petrified forms of Elias Thorne's experience. These were echoes. Echoes of presence, of memory, imprinted on the very air of the canyon. The whispers intensified, and now for the first time, I heard my own voice among them. Not just the echo of my hello, but phrases I'd thought, words I'd murmured to myself days ago. Just stress, exhaustion. I need to understand. The canyon was pulling my own thoughts, my own memories, out of my head and reflecting them back at me, distorted and unsettling. My mind reeled. This wasn't just acoustics. This was a place that absorbed and reflected memory, a living archive of every sound, every thought, every presence that had ever passed through it. And it was using them against me. Suddenly, a more concrete echo manifested. Ahead of me, down the canyon path, a figure appeared. It was me. A perfect, shimmering duplicate of myself, wearing my uniform, my backpack, even holding my flashlight. It stood there for a moment, eerily still, then turned and walked deeper into the canyon. No, I whispered, desperate plea. This was what the hikers had reported. Not just a reflection, but a mimicry, a projection. I forced myself to follow, my heart pounding. Was it a lure? Was it leading me somewhere? Or was it just a terrifying hallucination, born from the canyon's ability to warp reality? The duplicate led me deeper, disappearing and reappearing around bends in the canyon. The whispers grew louder, more personal, filled with my own anxieties, my own doubts. You're alone, Lena. No one will believe you. This forest will take you, just like the others. Then the echoes of movement began. I heard footsteps behind me, perfectly mimicking my own. I heard the faint rustle of clothing, the clink of my gear. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but saw nothing. Just the flickering impressions, the shifting echoes in the air. The canyon was surrounding me, filling the void with my own presence, my own terror. The air grew colder, and a new scent began to permeate the metallic dust, the faint acrid smell of ozone, like a storm brewing or something tearing at the fabric of reality. The rock walls around me seemed to pulse, a subtle, internal vibration that matched the beat of my frantic heart. I came to a dead end. A sheer rock face, rising impassably high. The duplicate of myself stood before it, its back to me, perfectly still. The whispers swelled into a roar, 1,000 echoing voices, all my own, screaming in unison. You are here. The voices resonated, no longer just echoes, but a combined, overwhelming presence emanating from the very walls. You are us. We are you. The duplicate turned. Its face was mine, but empty, its eyes black and hollow, reflecting only the gloom of the canyon. It slowly raised its hand, a perfect copy of my own, and reached out. As its spectral fingers touched my arm, a searing cold shot through me, an electric shock that made every nerve ending fire. I felt not just a draining of energy, but a siphoning of identity. It wasn't just pulling my life force, it was pulling me. My memories, my essence, were being drawn into the canyon, into the collective echoes of all who had passed through. I was being absorbed, not into a living tree, but into the very fabric of the rock, becoming another voiceless echo in its eternal chorus. My vision blurred, the canyon walls seeming to twist and stretch, the shadowy impressions blurring into a vortex of distorted forms. I felt myself slipping, my own thoughts becoming faint, distant, replaced by the chaotic rush of 1,000 other voices, other memories. I was dissolving, becoming part of the canyon. Just as the process threatened to consume me completely, a new sound pierced the cacophony. A sharp, resonant crack, like breaking glass. It wasn't an echo. It was real, distinct, a sound of defiance. My eyes snapped open, my blurring vision focusing on my hand. In my desperate struggle, my fingers had closed around a small, smooth river stone, picked up unknowingly from the canyon floor. And as the chilling touch of my doppelganger continued to drain me, I felt an almost primal urge. With a final desperate surge of will, fueled by instinct rather than reason, I swung my arm, smashing the stone against the slick, moss-covered canyon wall. The impact was shockingly loud, a sharp crack that resonated with a strange, unnatural clarity. And with it, the canyon seemed to gasp. The whispers faltered, the oppressive echoing ceased. The cold touch of my duplicate vanished. The ghostly figures flickering around me shuddered, their forms shimmering wildly, then dissipated like smoke. The duplicate of myself shimmered, its features distorting, stretching, then dissolved into nothingness. The canyon, for a moment, was utterly silent. No hum, no echoes, no whispers. Just the faint drip of water and the rustle of my own ragged breathing. I stumbled back, leaning against the rock wall, trembling uncontrollably. My head throbbed, and my mind felt raw, flayed, but clear. The stone, a simple river stone, still clutched in my hand, felt oddly warm now. I had no explanation. Perhaps the stone was of a unique composition, disrupting the canyon's strange abilities. Perhaps the sharp, unechoed sound had shattered the illusion, the psychic link. All I knew was that I had broken free. I made my way out of the canyon, slowly, cautiously. The deeper I got, the more the natural sounds of the forest returned. The distant chirping of birds, the rustle of wind through the redwoods, the familiar rhythm of the park. It was a symphony of sanity after the canyon's madness. Back at my cabin, I shed my uniform, now covered in mud and dust. My body was aching, my mind exhausted. I looked in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide, but they were my eyes reflecting my own thoughts, my own fears, not the collective memories of the canyon. The Whispering Canyon. A place that consumed presence, that imprinted memory, that reflected reality into madness. It had almost taken me, adding my voice to its eternal, echoing chorus. But I had found a way out. I wrapped the small river stone in a piece of cloth and placed it beside the obsidian shard in the locked box. Two talismans against the darkness, two reminders of the impossible things I had faced. The Redwood National Park still held its secrets. The ancient trees still stood, silent witnesses to countless ages. I had confronted the whisperer, and now the echo. I was still Lena Harding, park ranger. But each encounter changed me, adding layers of knowledge, layers of terror, and a grim determination. The forest was a living entity, vast and complex, its horrors varied and insidious. But I was learning its language, its weaknesses. And as the night fell and the familiar fog rolled in, I felt a new sense of purpose. I was not just a ranger protecting the land. I was a guardian against its darker, hidden truths. And I was ready for whatever came next. My name is Finn O'Connell, and for the better part of a decade, the remote, rugged expanse of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park has been my world. Specifically, the deep forgotten corners of it, far from the tourist trails and scenic overlooks. I'm a backcountry ranger, which means my office is a sprawling, untamed wilderness of ancient forests, mist-shrouded peaks, and hidden valleys. I prefer it that way. People are complicated. The mountains, for all their dangers, are usually straightforward. Usually. Lately, something has been wrong. It started subtly, like a shift in the wind. The usual sounds of the forest, the chatter of squirrels, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, began to thin, replaced by an unsettling hush. Not the deep silence before a storm, but a quiet that felt deliberate, as if the forest was holding its breath. Then came the disappearances. Not of hikers, but of hunters, experienced woodsmen who knew these ridges and valleys intimately. Their trucks would be found at trailheads, gear inside, but the men themselves simply vanished. No tracks, no struggle, just a void. My supervisor, a stoic woman named Ranger Hayes, had ordered me to investigate the latest disappearance, the seasoned bear hunter Jedediah Jed Stone, known for his stubborn independence and encyclopedic knowledge of the backcountry. His hunting dogs, usually inseparable, had been found whimpering and terrified, tied to a tree near his empty camp, refusing to go any deeper into the woods. Hayes tried to rationalize it, a fall, an animal attack, but her eyes held a flicker of genuine apprehension. She knew, as I did, that something was profoundly amiss. My patrol took me into the notorious Shadow Creek Valley, a narrow, perpetually shaded gorge known for its dense, ancient pine forests and a pervasive sense of gloom. Locals avoided it, whispering tales of lost voices and shadow walkers. I always scoffed at such superstitions, grounding myself in logic and training. But as I strapped on my pack, checked my .30-06 rifle, and headed into the valley, a cold unease began to settle in my gut. The trail into Shadow Creek was barely discernible, overgrown with thick rhododendron and tangled mountain laurel. The air grew immediately colder, heavy with the sharp, resinous scent of pine needles and damp earth. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the impossibly thick canopy of pines, casting the valley floor in a perpetual, oppressive twilight. The silence here was absolute, profound. No birdsong, no insects, not even the distant murmur of the creek that gave the valley its name. The pine trees themselves were different here. Taller, more ancient than any I had seen, their needles a darker, almost black-green. Their trunks were covered in thick, dark moss that seemed to writhe, and their branches intertwined so tightly above, they formed a living ceiling, blotting out the sky. It felt less like a forest and more like a vast organic prison. As I pushed deeper, the silence became a tangible presence, pressing in on my ears, creating a dull ache behind my eardrums. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active vacuum, absorbing every vibration, every rustle. My own footsteps, normally crunching on pine needles, were muffled, almost silent. My breath was a shallow, soundless gasp. And then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like dry leaves skittering across a distant, polished surface. It wasn't the wind. There was no breeze in this suffocating quiet. It was a whisper. It was too soft to discern words, just a sibilant dry hiss that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the ancient pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. It was cold, insidious, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the physical exertion. "Jed," I called out, my voice sounding impossibly loud in the profound silence, then instantly swallowed, dying in my throat without an echo. The whisper intensified, a low, collective murmur, rising slightly in volume, as if roused by my voice. I kept moving, slowly, cautiously, my rifle held ready. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the ancient, moss-covered pine trunks. They seemed to press in on me, their shadows stretching long and distorted, like skeletal hands grasping in the twilight. The whispers were growing louder, surrounding me, a constant dry hiss that spoke of age and dust and unspeakable secrets. I rounded a bend in the barely there trail and saw it. Jed Stone's camp. It was a scene frozen in time, a small, expertly built lean-to, a fire pit with cold embers, a half-eaten can of beans on a rock, and Jed's rifle propped against a tree, exactly where he would have left it. But Jed himself was gone. The whispers intensified around the camp, swirling like an invisible vortex. I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold air, but from something ancient and malevolent. It was here. Whatever had taken Jed, it was here, or had been. I noticed something strange about the pine needles on the ground around the camp. They weren't loose. They seemed to be intertwined, woven together in a complex, almost artificial pattern. And from beneath them, a faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap began to emerge. It was too regular, too deliberate to be natural. I knelt, pushing aside the matted needles, my heart hammering against my ribs. What lay beneath made my stomach churn. It was a skeleton. Not buried, but lying directly beneath the woven pine needles. A human skeleton picked clean, but arranged with a grotesque artistry. The bones were impossibly white, almost translucent, and seemed to hum with the same dry whisper that filled the air. And then, as I looked closer, I saw that the bones were not just bones. They were subtly intertwined with fibrous strands, with pine needles, with tiny, hair-thin roots that seemed to be growing into them, integrating with the bone structure. It was as if the very forest was consuming the remains, turning them into a part of itself. The whispers around me intensified, focusing on the skeleton, drawing me closer. And then, from the empty eye sockets of the skull, a faint, sibilant sea emerged, like air escaping a deflating balloon. It was cold, empty, yet undeniably mournful. It was Jed, not a reanimated corpse like Lena's lake horrors, nor a petrified body. This was something different. The very essence of the forest consuming, preserving, and then reflecting the last vestiges of its victims. The dry rustling sound intensified, and the air around the skeleton began to shimmer. Faint, ethereal outlines appeared, like heat haze but colder, like the ghost of a human form. They flickered, indistinct and horrifying, dancing around the skeletal remains. They were the lost voices, the shadow walkers of local legend, the spectral echoes of all who had been consumed here. "He's mine," a whisper hissed, clearer now, emanating from the swirling forms, coalescing into a single chilling voice that resonated directly in my mind. It was a chorus of dry, rustling sounds forming words, cold and possessive. All of them. Mine. I scrambled back, my rifle forgotten. This was not a physical threat I could shoot. This was something that stole life, stole essence, and then whispered its triumph. The ethereal forms surged forward, swirling around me, their ghostly presence radiating an unbearable cold. The whispers became a cacophony, a thousand dry voices screaming in triumph and hunger. The tap-tap-tap beneath the pine needles accelerated, becoming a frantic, rhythmic beat, as if something vast and unseen was building, weaving, growing beneath the earth. I realized with a sickening jolt, the woven pine needles, the fibrous strands, the growing roots, the forest wasn't just consuming the dead. It was using them. They were becoming part of a vast organic network, a living, sentient loom. And whatever that loom was weaving, it was something horrifying. The ghostly forms pressed closer, and I felt a chilling presence brushing against my skin, cold and dry, like old dust. It wasn't physical contact, but a violation, a psychic intrusion. I felt my own memories, my own fears, being gently, insidiously probed, like a spider testing a newly caught fly. It was searching for something, something it could weave. "You will join them," the whisper hissed, now intimately close, directly in my ear, resonating through my skull. "You will be woven. You will whisper with us." Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I stumbled backwards, desperate to escape the swirling spectral forms, the insidious cold, the terrifying promise of becoming part of the whispering pines. My hands, instinctively, found a heavy, fallen branch. It was covered in the same thick, dark moss as the trees, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt a faint, rhythmic pulsation, a slow, deep beat that matched the tap-tap-tap from beneath the ground. The branch was alive. All the pines were. With a desperate, animalistic roar, I swung the branch, not at the spectral forms, but at the ancient pine trunk next to Jed's skeleton, the one that seemed to hum with the most malevolence. The impact was solid, dull, and yet I felt something give. A faint tremor ran through the ground, and the whispers faltered for a moment, a collective gasp of surprise. The moss on the tree trunk peeled back, revealing not just bark, but a network of pale, glistening, fibrous strands, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. This was it. This was the weaving, the living loom. The spectral forms shrieked, their whispers turning into an enraged, dry gale that buffeted me. The tap-tap-tap beneath the ground intensified, becoming a furious, frantic thrum. The very air grew thick with pine needles and dust, swirling around me, trying to blind and suffocate. I swung again and again, pouring all my fear and desperation into each blow, aiming to tear apart the living loom, to break the connection. The fibrous strands tore with a wet, ripping sound, oozing a clear, viscous sap that smelled of pine and something metallic, like burnt copper. With each strike, the spectral forms flickered, weakening. The furious whispers became broken, fragmented, like a chorus line losing its timing. The tap-tap-tap grew erratic, sputtering. Finally, with a last, desperate swing, the branch connected with a particularly thick cluster of the glistening fibers, and they tore with a final, sickening snap. The whispers died. The spectral forms vanished. The tap-tap-tap beneath the ground ceased completely. The air in the valley instantly cleared, the oppressive silence replaced by a profound, yet natural quiet. The crushing cold lifted, replaced by the normal coolness of the mountain air. The pine needles on the ground around Jed's camp were no longer intricately woven, but scattered naturally. I stood there, gasping for breath, the heavy branch still clutched in my hands. The pine tree I had attacked stood silent, its raw wound oozing clear sap, but its malevolence gone. Jed's skeleton remained, picked clean, but the intricate weaving of fibers into its bones had receded, leaving it just bones. I made my way out of Shadow Creek Valley, my body aching, my mind raw but clear. The pine needles underfoot were just needles, the trees just trees. The sun, finally breaking through the heavy canopy outside the valley, felt warm and real on my face. Back at my cabin, I stripped off my uniform, covered in sap and dirt. My hands trembled, but they were my hands solid, real. My mind, though exhausted, felt whole. The whispering pines of Shadow Creek, a place that consumed essence, wove it into a living tapestry of memory and torment, and then whispered its victim's existence to anyone who strayed too deep. It had almost taken me, adding my voice to its eternal dry chorus. But I had found a way to unravel its grim work. I collected a small bundle of the dark, fibrous pine needles from the wound of the tree, now inert and brittle, and placed them in a new compartment of my growing collection. Another piece of the puzzle, another grim trophy against the darkness. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was still a wild and beautiful place, but I now saw its hidden depths, its ancient, consuming hungers. I was Finn O'Connell, backcountry ranger, and I was becoming a chronicler, a guardian against the unseen, unspeakable forces that lay hidden beneath the moss and pine needles. The night was falling, but I was no longer afraid of the whispers. I knew their source, and I knew how to silence them.